All right, everyone, thanks for attending. My name's Ryan. I'm the chair of the Maoist Communist Union. We're a pre-party organization here in the United States. And we're a communist organization that aims to develop the revolutionary movement through fusing Marxism with the working class movement and eventually building up to the formation of a vanguard party capable of leading not only the working class struggle, but also the struggle of all oppressed groups in the country for socialism, for the revolutionary transformation of the society and the establishment of a socialist society, which doesn't mean getting Zoran elected or anything like that. It means really revolution, overthrowing the capitalist class and establishing what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. So if you're interested, check out our literature. We have our study that's ongoing right now on socialism and the class struggles under socialism if you want to get beyond a basic service level understanding and dive into a more in-depth and nuanced view of how the struggle continues under socialism and how actually you have to continue the revolution after having a successful revolution to prevent capitalist restoration. And that's just an important topic given that our present moment is defined in a meaningful sense by not only the successes but also the defeats of the revolutions of the 20th century, where in order to really make Marxism a living reality, a concrete force in this country, we need to be able to explain to the population at large, and the working class especially, what happened in these revolutions and why they were eventually defeated not from without but from within. It's the only way to give them a real hope, not a naive optimism they're sold in self-help books and a million guides to get rich quick and so on. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about surveillance. Before I dive into that, I want to mention that just coming through in the news right now is the US has resumed strikes on Iran. We don't know the scale and extent of these strikes. There's some reports that I couldn't quickly verify that showed that it seems like some of the US proxy forces in Iraq have started to move into Iran, into Western Iran, and there's some fighting in the mountains there. It's not clear how extensive that is, if that's just small skirmishes. Additionally, Israel just got the Lebanese government to sign a treaty or some sort of deal acknowledging like de facto and permanent Israeli control of sections of southern Lebanon in obvious violation of the Memorandum of Understanding and the ceasefire, which seems to indicate, at least in the short term, that the Iran war is back on. Now, this makes the topic of this presentation all the more important and relevant insofar as one of the great pressures in the US society that's pushing the bourgeoisie more and more to adopt an extremely repressive form of surveillance is the external conditions of the decline of the US empire. That is not in the immediate internal situation of the country, but rather the US is losing ground globally. The Iran war is the most clear indication of that. And the Wall Street Journal just published a report today that indicated that the extent and scope of US bases, the damage to US bases in the region is so great that many of the bases will be permanently evacuated. And what isn't evacuated may be moved to underground facilities. That's in Bahrain, Eastern Saudi Arabia, UAE. We're talking about a US retreat from the region being acknowledged even in the Wall Street Journal. Now, that was the analysis that we put forward at the start of the war. It's proven to basically be correct. And I think the US restarting the kinetic activity here, bombing Iran, etc., will only make the scale and scope of US defeat worse. At the same time, we may see some real ramping up of repression here. So I'll get into that more. I'll just say one more thing. It's important to remember we've seen a number of attempts since the start of the Iran war by the US government to create false flag attacks. At UFC 2050 nonsense, they had a supposed false flag attack that the FBI was so worried about that, a supposed terrorist attack that was clearly a false flag attack, that the FBI was so worried about that Kash Patel was just in attendance to watch the fighting. So they didn't really think it was anything of a threat. They had this whole thing with the fake stolen drones that supposedly were going to be used on LA, of all places. Look how far LA is from Iran. Why wouldn't they hit the East Coast? Doesn't make any sense. These were quickly debunked online, and the government kind of shut up about them. But it wouldn't be crazy, and in fact, you'd have to be crazy to not expect some future efforts in possibly even the near term to have some sort of false flag attack to try to justify a new rollout of more repression. We've seen, again, I think half a dozen attempts at least since the start of the Iran war, all of which have been discredited and have not gotten popular support. So today we're going to be talking about surveillance and organizing for revolution. And this is a fairly complicated topic to discuss because on the one hand, the reality of the US ruling class is kind of terrifying. They have a huge repressive force and apparatus. They're spying on every single conversation. They listen to everything. Everyone has a wiretap they carry around in their pocket that's way more advanced than the wiretaps the FBI used in the 60s and 70s. But on the other hand, we have, and we'll come back to this example, but here's our agenda, AI surveillance used to be for monitoring the Mountain Dew reflecting pool that's been created. And so we have a ruling class that's like really powerful, has a huge amount of repressive machinery at its disposal, but is exceedingly stupid and inept and can't even deal with repainting a reflecting pool without fucking it up on every level, like the paint falling apart and coming off, the lining breaking, the water being filled with algae. Now they've got National Guards and fences, and actually the latest photos show they put like danger explosion warnings all over the fences they put up around the reflecting pool to stop people from going there. And for the record, they've arrested more people for violating the new rules they put up around the reflecting pool than they've arrested for the Epstein files. So with idiots like that in charge, and I mean from both parties, to be clear, it seems a little bit less scary. And we'll get into some other reasons of why there's reasons not to be paralyzed with fear despite the real scary stuff the government's doing. But here's our rough agenda. I won't read it out to you, but we'll go through some of the basic realities of what's happening. We'll ground ourselves in some fundamental Marxist principles and lessons that come from the legacy of struggles of hundreds of millions of people before us, so we can get an orientation of how to deal with the reality in front of us. And then we'll go back into some more of what's happening, in particular in the US and the pressures in the US ruling class. So we'll dive into it now. So as people probably know, surveillance, which has been a ubiquitous feature of American life since 9/11, is really increasing over the last few years. I mean, they're rolling out these flock cameras all across the country. This is one outside of a mall. They're outside of playgrounds. They're literally pointing at playgrounds now. They're on every major street in major cities. It's increasingly hard to travel around anywhere without being surveilled by the flock cameras, which are somewhat of the kind of cutting edge of surveillance in the US. It's kind of a weird system compared to other countries because Flock is a private company. They're creating all these contracts with different municipalities. So we see actually some of the contradictions in the US states rollout of this unprecedented surveillance right there, because some townships have then, under public pressure, rolled back their plans with Flock and even canceled Flock contracts. And then in some cases the cameras remain up, other cases they're vandalized or just taken down by citizens, or people put bags over them just to block them. It's not like in some other countries where there's a much more centralized system where the government just rolls out a unified surveillance system. It's pretty messy and patchwork, and that's actually an advantage for us despite the new repression being rolled out. There's obviously this insane build out of data centers to go with this, and we'll talk a decent amount about data centers today because they're very central to the surveillance plans and to the US government's plans for everything. There's so much anger. People may not be like totally aware of it here in New York City because there's not, as far as I know, any major data centers being built here, but there's so much anger right now around the country about these data centers. I mean, so much mass outrage and protest because they pollute the water, they have huge electricity demands, and they pollute the air. They have terrible noise pollution. It's like hell to live near one of these things, and it's just ruining people's whole lives on a scale, as we'll see, that's really insane. And then you have people like Jeff Bezos saying, you know, one of the problems we're facing with AI is that all the abundance we'll get from AI is really being impeded by the human demand for water. It's like cartoon villain shit. Like, oh yeah, you know, AI will be really great for you, but you can't have any water because we need it for AI. I mean, how much more transparent and stupid can the capitalists get when they make statements like that? It's not a subtle pitch that they're making that tricks people. People are like, you're saying I'm not gonna have water, but I'll get like AI slop videos on my feed? All right. In addition to the data centers, and really integrated with them, is a series of different systems that roll out what's called a digital fingerprint. This is a way to use biometric scanning, to use your Bluetooth from your phone, your GPS signals on whatever devices, Bluetooth on your headset, your car, license plate, whatever, all of it, to create a digital fingerprint that can be used to identify you anywhere you go and at all times. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but the basic paradigm for surveillance that the US government has is total data capture. That is every single point of data. They want to capture it, they want to monitor it, they want to plug it into their system, even if you haven't done any crime, as part of a pre-crime screening program, and to just study the population and control it as best as possible. This is not a new paradigm, it's actually an old one going back 50 plus years. And it's possible in new ways now with the new technology and with the new push to build out the surveillance. There's also been a discovery, this is actually a tweet celebrating this cool open source project that shows that you can use Wi-Fi to spy on anyone. So your Wi-Fi in your house, basically just a very simple program, allows you to monitor, or anyone who has access to your Wi-Fi can use it to monitor every single person in your house, can, through walls that are at least, as long as they're not 5 feet thick, you can see through the walls. You can measure heart rate and breath rate. Pretty dystopian. And of course, there's these Ring cameras going up everywhere. There was tremendous backlash after the Super Bowl ads, where it was like, oh, we'll find dogs with your Ring camera, just activate this, and like everyone's Ring network will, be connected. But Ring, even if you get one and then disable it and cancel the subscription, it's still active actually, and it's still monitoring, and law enforcement has immediate access to it and so on. And there's this big push too, people may have seen some ads for this, and you may know some coworkers who have them, to roll out these AI glasses, meta glasses. This is one of Kylie Jenner, I think, who's part of the face of this new campaign of influencers who are saying, oh, look at the cool new stylish glasses that have cameras all the time that see everything you see. And who gets fed that data? And let's be real, who's wearing these glasses most of the time, actually? And some influencers, some people, ICE agents, police now across the country. All the time, constant feed being plugged into the data centers to monitor us in all new ways. The new generation of AirPods will have built-in cameras to help you in case you're like, what's that in front of me, Siri? And I'm saying that a bit facetiously because obviously this is to get more data to surveil your daily life more and more so that nothing you do or see is undocumented by the government. But also, it's important to remember that Sam Altman said, we want intelligence to be a utility that you rent and pay for. Meaning they want to actually use AI, at least a section of the ruling class, to dumb people down so much that they're like, what's that in front of me? What's going on? I don't know. And to defer all of our cognitive activity, which is essential for us to get free, which is to say we need to think and work together to think how to fight for our collective liberation, they want us to farm that out to AI and get only government and corporate approved answers. The new generations of AirPods will also have brain sensors. This is part of the patent that Apple filed just this past year. Actually, this is from a few years ago, but the new generation, I think starting next year, will have these sensors that monitor your brain activity while you listen to music and take calls and stuff. So it's getting fairly dystopian even at the level of personal electronics. Anyone here have a car? I know not many people in New York City do, but a decent number of people have cars. Anyone have a new car from the last few years? Did you know that the Ford Motor Corporation in 2023, actually they filed it in 2024, submitted a patent to use all of the surveillance they have on cars to automatically integrate into law enforcement and to use the cameras, including the cameras in the car, to detect if someone walking by has committed a crime and automatically report that to the police? And all new cars from Ford, from GM, a bunch of other corporations have this. We're actually going to watch a little video that went really viral. It had, I think, 10 plus million views, maybe more, about this. This is from a guy who's not a communist, who's not, I think, even a progressive. But this will show you the other side of this sort of surveillance. That American society that's used to the life of a petty proprietor, where you have your house and your car and, relative privacy from corporations and governments and maybe your neighbors and your family and so on. And there's a lot of antisocial stuff there. But there's incredible anger about this. And this is a pretty good video, I think, breaking down how insane basically all new cars are. So on this side,
come on! No! Now imagine there was an emergency outside the truck, an accident, something terrible on the ranch with a chainsaw. And I jump in this truck, but the truck, it won't shift into drive. Why? Because the cameras and sensors inside this cab won't let it shift, because it detects my eyes are big, there's a lot of emotion, there's some panic, and it doesn't feel that I'm fit to drive. Now that's not science fiction, that is happening because Ford just filed the patents. Ford actually has a series of patents down at the US Patent and Trade Office that deal with the sensors and cameras inside the cab of their truck. And if the sensors in that truck determine that you're not fit to drive, that truck will not actually shift from park to drive. Now they already have a system called telematics, and that's where they can actually pull up cameras in real time inside the cab of their fleet vehicles. Now, they actually market this to insurance companies because the truth is, this is really about who owns the data and who owns the liability. Now, your name might actually be on the title of this truck, and you may have paid for it, but you don't own it. Now, Ford didn't file just one patent. They filed a stack of them, all within months of each other. Are you sitting down? Get this. This Ford technology patent doesn't just watch you. This one puts you in jail. Ford filed a patent, serial number 0104469, where the system takes your biometric data, your face, your iris, and your fingerprint, and it runs it through a criminal database in real time. While you're sitting in your own truck, think about what that means. You wake up one morning, you walk out to your driveway, you climb into a vehicle with your name on the title, on property with your name on the deed, and before you go anywhere, before you've done a single thing wrong, your truck is already running your face through a law enforcement database. Ford's own patent language describes this as potentially useful for police. They wrote that. Ford wrote that into the patent application. So the question isn't whether this technology can be abused. Ford already told you who it's for. You just didn't know that you were buying a cop car. Now I'm going to walk you through a few of these patents. Lip reading, cameras inside your cab, machine learning trained on lip movement datasets, cloud connected, your face processed somewhere you'll never see, stored as long as they want. Acoustic lip reading, if the cameras aren't enough, the system emits inaudible sound waves and reads the echoes bouncing off of your mouth. You can't see it, it's just happening. Biometrics, your face, fingerprint, iris, filed February 2024, and it was published August 2025. This one is assigned a serial number because it's real. Ad listening, this is scary. It monitors conversations between everyone in the cab. It serves targeted ads based on what you and others are talking about while you're driving. In Ford's words, maximum opportunity for ad-based monetization. No description of how that data is protected either. None. How about Ford Pro Telematics? Now this one isn't a patent. This one is actually a product page. Right now, fleet managers can pull live in-cabin video feeds of drivers on their phones. Ford markets seatbelt compliance alerts with the explicit benefit of lowering insurance costs. They said it themselves. This is the infrastructure, and once the infrastructure exists, it's going to get used and abused. Now, Ford isn't alone in this. This is an arms race. Smart Eye driver monitoring software is already in over 2 million cars globally. The EU's general safety regulation mandates drowsiness systems as standard equipment going forward. GM deployed biometric seat sensors and heart rate monitoring in production trucks.
So, to be clear, I didn't say this guy is not a communist or not a progressive to malign him. I'm saying that to note the shift that's taking place in this country, which is a broad popular awareness that the US government and the big corporations serve what we can call the Epstein class. I know it's not a totally scientific definition, it's somewhat ambiguous, but the section of the monopoly capitalists who are doing things like international human trafficking, like creating genocides around the world, etc. We're not talking about a small, capitalist running a small factory or something. We're talking about the government serving the big, giant corporations. And this shift in popular awareness was ongoing before the rollout of this surveillance. The shift in popular awareness was ongoing. People were looking at this saying, the government, I really, really, really don't trust it. And actually a lot of people mistakenly rallied to Trump to one degree or another, believing that he was going to drain the swamp and get rid of a lot of the problems. And instead he's gone, all in for Israel and Epstein. And in this situation where people are very angry, the government and the big corporations are freaking out. And so we're seeing this rollout of surveillance on an unprecedented level because they understand that the people of this country, the productive masses in this country, are a threat to the rule of a tiny parasitic minority. And that's why they need surveillance, because we live in a society with a state system that benefits a tiny minority who leech the wealth of our collective labor for themselves, for their own lavish lifestyle, and to further immiserate and impoverish us and the people of the world. And all of this surveillance technology is being handed to basically idiotic thugs who the government's recruiting to do their bidding and have their little fun cracking skulls and killing people. ICE is one example of this. We'll have many more in the coming decade. Take the flock cameras. There's already been a huge problem with the flock cameras because anyone can really access the data. They're actually very insecure. It's very easy to go online and access the stream. But the cops in particular who have access to it, they are using it to stalk ex-girlfriends, their own girlfriends and wives, different people in their lives, family members, etc. It's going to be the case fairly soon that, say, for example, cops work with someone like these Zionist militias here in the US, and they hand over that data to go after Palestinian activists. And it's like, oh, it wasn't the government that did it, it was just some far-right group, etc. These things are used with the full knowledge of the government often to have paramilitary forces attack leftists, communists, protesters, etc. And we'll see a lot more of that. So all this hopefully helps to clarify, on the one hand, some of the opposition, and we'll talk a lot more about that shortly, but also the scale and scope of the surveillance that's being rolled out. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But before we go any further, I want to just step back and look at history and the history of popular struggles against oppression. Because in the US, we've lived in this cult of individualism, in this society that there's a term that was coined a few years ago, I think is pretty apt, of treatlerism. It's a portmanteau of treat and Hitler. People are just obsessed with getting their little 5 shots of caramel and their iced latte, and if they don't have that, they have a fucking meltdown. And we've been told that the pinnacle of human existence is individual self-realization through consumer society. And because of the collective amnesia in the society of our shared struggles for our liberation, it's very easy to functionally, even if one nominally rejects these things, to functionally see human existence as about basically individual self-realization and commodity consumption. And because of that, and the real cult of the individual that exists in the society, it's often very hard to have a perspective of the collective struggles for liberation and how they're much bigger than any one of us. And long after people who fought in revolutionary struggles, or even just working class struggles, strike struggles, peasant struggles, whatever, long after they're dead and gone and forgotten, their legacy lives on. It inspires people for hundreds or even thousands of years. One example of this is the Spartacus rebellion in ancient Rome. And that was where slaves and a lot of gladiators initially, but then slaves all over the Roman society rose up and waged a war for their liberation. They were defeated. But then, almost 2,000 years later, over 2,000 years later, in Germany during the German Revolution, the communists there named themselves after the Spartacus rebellion and identified very strongly with it and saw their movement as aligned with this movement. And that just shows actually how much more than ourselves we are as humans. We're social animals. We participate in transforming the social reality, not just buying some shit so we can veg out for a few hours and doom scroll. And it's sad to see people say that's what life is, or some variant thereof. Processing your trauma so you can be enlightened, and all that stuff. So I want to go to a few examples from the Chinese Revolution, and actually talk first about the Chinese Revolution's perspective on the Palestinian struggle from 50 years ago. And we'll see, I think, the clairvoyance with which the Chinese revolutionaries spoke of the Palestinian struggle to give us just some perspective on what the struggle against oppression, even very scary and powerful oppressive forces, is about. So this is Zhou Enlai. He was in charge of the foreign ministry. He was kind of China's chief diplomat in the revolutionary period. And he was speaking here to some Palestinian revolutionary organizations in 1967. And he said, "Today, the oppressed Arab people and the disaster-ridden Palestinians have stood up. Wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. Wherever there is aggression, there is struggle against aggression. I believe that having taken up arms, the revolutionary Arab people of Palestine and the entire Arab people will not lay down their arms, and like the heroic Vietnamese people, will fight on unflinchingly, resolutely, and stubbornly until final victory." And more than 50 years later, we can see how correct this assessment was, which is to say this Palestinian struggle, despite everything, despite facing the most intense form of surveillance and oppression we've ever seen in human history, they're still fighting on. And I'm sure people have seen the videos from Al-Qassam brigades in Gaza, where they've been in open-air prison for 10 plus years longer, basically, that Gaza's been that. They've been bombarded for the last 3 years almost, and despite that, they continuously inflict devastating losses on the so-called IDF. The Israeli military has repeatedly been unable to control all of Gaza because of the Palestinian resistance. And that has had echoes far, far, far beyond the Gaza Strip and far beyond Palestine and far beyond the Arab world. It's inspired people literally all over the world because their struggle is, in a very, very, very serious sense, our struggle. That is, the struggle for the liberation of Palestine is caught up with the broader struggle for the revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist class, for the end of imperialism, and ultimately the struggle for communism. And we can see this very clearly in the fact that all the surveillance technologies, literally Palantir, is deploying its cutting-edge technology against the Palestinians. So this perspective that Zhou Enlai lays out here is basically the perspective we have to have around all the popular struggles. Now, Mao talked about this right after the success of the Chinese Revolution. He said, "Make trouble, fail. Make trouble again, fail again, until they're doomed." That is the logic of the imperialists and all the reactionaries the world over in dealing with the people's cause. And they will never go against the logic, this logic. This is a Marxist law. When we say imperialism is ferocious, we mean that its nature will never change, that the imperialists will never lay down their butcher's knives, that they will never become Buddhas till they're doomed. Fight, fail. Fight again, fail again. Fight again until their victory. That is the logic of the people. And they too will never go against this logic. This is another Marxist law. The Russian Revolution followed this law, and so has the Chinese People's Revolution. Now, the Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921. Nationwide liberation was achieved in 1949. When that happened, Mao said, "We've taken but one small step on a 10,000-mile long march." And he saw that actually the class struggle would continue under socialism. Unfortunately, shortly after Mao's death, the right, the capitalist voters in their party, waged a coup. But actually, the people in China fighting against the capitalist class that currently rules China, the billionaires in the party, who run the party, those people in China fighting against the billionaires in the party, they draw on the lessons of the Chinese Revolution and of the struggles under socialism in their fight for a new revolution in China. So we see that and how it lives on today. But when Mao was talking in 1949, he was speaking after a century of Chinese struggle against foreign domination and colonialism. If we go back to shortly after the First Opium War and look at the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which was a huge revolt in China, anti-imperialist revolt against the foreign occupation of China. This is a war that really should have been called World War China, because somewhere between 20 and 30, maybe even 100 million people died in this process, in this war. It was a war for liberation, which was brutally suppressed by the imperialists. Really, at that time, they weren't full-on capitalist imperialists, but these big colonial empires. And Britain, France, etc. They put down this revolt, which was against the corrupt Qing dynasty and also the foreign powers occupying China and poisoning the population with opium. Now, individuals gave up. But did the Chinese people give up? No. They kept fighting and fighting and revolting again and again and again. And if you look at a timeline of the history of China, you see after the Taiping Revolt was defeated, one revolt after another until their final victory. And there was a very important moment in the Chinese Revolution. The Taiping rebels were defeated crossing the Dadu River. And in the Chinese Revolution, they had a moment called crossing the Luding Bridge, where they had to cross this bridge over the same river that the Taiping rebels failed at, and they were crushed by the imperialists in the Qing dynasty. And it was a huge moment. You can read about it in Red Star for China, where they had to go across this bridge that the Chinese nationalists had actually lit on fire. And at the time when they crossed this river and crossed this bridge and escaped temporary encirclement that would have destroyed them in the Long March, many comrades in the Chinese movement, they broke down crying, knowing that the symbolic victory they had, where almost 100 years previously the Taiping rebels had been defeated, that with that symbolic victory they had advanced a step further than the Taiping rebels had. It's sort of the same thing in a certain sense as Lenin. After the Russian Revolution had lasted 73 days, he went out and danced in the snow. Why 73 days? Because the Paris Commune, which had happened 40 years prior, had only lasted 72 days. And so Lenin knew that just by holding on for 73 days after the revolution, they had advanced that much further. And that even if they were defeated after that, the advances they had made would be used by future generations. And this is essential for the long-term perspective of communists. This is what Mao talks about in a text called Reform Our Study, actually before the victory of the Chinese Revolution, but in 41. He says, for 100 years, the finest sons and daughters of the disaster-ridden Chinese nation fought and sacrificed their lives, one stepping into the breach as another fell, in the quest for the truth that would save the country and the people. This moves us to song and tears. But it was only after World War I and the October Revolution in Russia that we found Marxism-Leninism, the best of truths, and the weapon for liberating our nation. And the best of weapons for liberating our nation. The Communist Party of China has been the initiator, propagandist, and organizer in wielding this weapon. As soon as it was linked with the concrete practice of the Chinese Revolution, the universal truth of Marxism-Leninism gave an entirely new complexion to the Chinese Revolution. And this is true, and it's true also in our circumstances, that if we can apply the lessons of Marxism to the really endless series of popular revolts that really define the people's history of this country, then we can advance on a similar path. Then no enemy, no matter how terrifying and challenging and powerful, can stop us. Because actually, the reality is that the popular forces are far, far greater in number and strength than the repressive forces. And you have to ask yourself, well, we'll come to it in a second, actually. So if we could hold on to this perspective, it's a lot easier to understand while this rollout of new technology and surveillance is very terrifying, it's new for all of our lifetimes, it's going to be a lot more repressive in this country going forward. It's not, in a certain sense, unprecedented to have this level of repression in human history. I mean, the Russian Marxists dealt with it. When students protested in support of striking workers in the late 19th century in Russia, the students were deported to Siberia, to prison labor camps. Actually, in comparison, the repression that Columbia students saw, not that it wasn't significant, but the repression Columbia students saw around the Palestine protests was comparatively less, despite it being unprecedented in recent history. So with this longer term perspective, it doesn't make the repression go away. It's not like we magically are able to defeat every instance of repression, but we're able to understand much better how we can fight and how we can win and not just be cowed down in fear about the latest new horror the bourgeoisie is bringing against us. And again, I'd like to remind you of the idiocy of the ruling class in this country. The reflecting pool. They paved it with rhino liner, which is not meant for a pool of that size, it's meant for the back of a pickup truck. They then drove over it before the rhino liner was dry, cracking it and weakening it because Trump wanted to have his motorcade go over it. They then painted it without cleaning it, and then, of course, it fell apart. And this is a nice little satirical tweet, but very typical of the woke liberal media, won't give our president credit for filling the reflecting pool with delicious, refreshing Mountain Dew. But really, think about it for a second. I mean, there's very clear documented evidence that's gone very viral about the insanity of the reflecting pool. Then the administration says this is all a lie while they install AI surveillance and National Guard members all around the reflecting pool and fence it off and say, this is liberal media lie and we're going to arrest anyone who says otherwise or takes a photo or goes to the reflecting pool. Now, imagine you're part of the security services in this country. Imagine you're working at a company that's compiling some of this data. How inspired do you feel to help this administration repress people who are going up and taking pictures of the reflecting pool? How inspired do you feel to roll out fascism in this country for the Mountain Dew pool? I mean, not very inspired, I would imagine. And especially when you find out that this gentleman, John Cafaro, who says Trump is one of his best friends, was the guy who made tens of millions of dollars off this whole scam, paving the reflecting pool. I mean, it's almost Looney Tunes levels of corruption and stupidity. And I say that because it's essential for revolutionaries, to understand, but then to carry out a splitting within the repressive apparatus. In Russia and in China and in every successful revolution, it's always been the case that a significant number of people who are in the repressive apparatus at one level or another, when this sort of blanket, we're going to arrest everyone, gets put out, they say, I don't really want to do this. This is fucked up. And if you read a little bit of the reporting around ICE deployment in Minneapolis, ICE leaked like a sieve. Now, some people were like, hoorah, let's go crack some libtard skulls. But a lot of these ICE officers were like, this is too much even for me. And they dissented. They didn't want to go to Minneapolis. They leaked a huge amount of information to the press to say, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what we're being told to do. Here's how fucked up it is. Here's how racist it is, all that stuff. And we got information about that. Now, they went to a lot of the liberal press or some of the better independent journalists. But once there's a significant communist force, they go to the communists. And you look at how the Tsarist administration leaked to the Bolshevik Party. You look at how Chiang Kai-shek's government in China, the Nationalist Party that ruled a huge section of China and repressed people and shot people in the streets left and right, they not only leaked, but they had high-ranking members of the government that supported the communists in secret. And when the revolution happened, they said, oh, sorry, Chiang Kai-shek, you can't run away with all the gold. We've already talked to the communists and we're going to make sure it doesn't get taken by you to give to the Americans. And so on and so forth. So we can see, and this is an essential thing to really understand, that the bourgeois state apparatus has to be populated not by people with Jeff Bezos and run by a lot of the people, but by a lot of average people. Yeah, there's high-ranking administrators like Fauci who are sick and twisted, and Dan Bongino and Kash Patel and Greg Bovino and so on. But there's also just a lot of people who are there and are kind of like going along with stuff. But then when they see the newest thing get rolled out, they're like, fuck, I can't support this. I can't sleep at night with this shit. It's not a unified repressive force that the bourgeoisie can just use to crush people. It has a lot of contradictions within it. And again, it's not just Trump that's an idiot. I remember the Biden administration's evacuation of Afghanistan and the withdrawal. It was a total fucking disaster. And that fuck up spans like 5 presidential administrations, 4 or 5, I think 5, yeah. No, 4. The Afghan war, it's like one administration after another, one party after another, the best and brightest in the military, all the big corporations, they collectively fucked up this war so bad that they spent trillions of dollars to replace the Taliban with the Taliban in 2 decades. And that's not exactly the activity of a government that's capable of keeping people down in the face of serious and determined resistance. And even Wikipedia has to acknowledge that the Iran war, which again, as I said at the beginning of this, is restarting now, is already an Iranian victory and a decisive one. Even Wikipedia. And of course, on a global scale in competition with China, the US is losing not only in manufacturing output, but in basically every relevant metric. The US ruling class is a class in decline. It's an empire in decline. It's getting beaten by its rivals. It can't hold on to its colonies and neo-colonies. And its allies, it's pissing them off, and they're increasingly looking for a greater degree of independence. And its vassals are breaking free from it to one extent or another. This is not a class on the rise as the US was in the 1940s, where the bourgeoisie had just tied the whole world in chains, or a big portion of it. This is a class freaking the fuck out as it's in decline and rolling out a repressive apparatus that it hopes will allow it to hold on to power as it loses power globally. We'll get into that a little bit more and break those things down more systematically. But with that perspective, it's easy to understand why the ruling class in the US is not all powerful, but in fact is increasingly operating from a position of weakness. Now, we need to keep in mind Mao's statement that the imperialists are paper tigers. Mao didn't mean paper tigers meaning they're easy. He said they have a real aspect, a real tiger. They're dangerous, they kill people. But in the end, they're paper tigers because the people, once they're united, can defeat them. And time again, that's been shown. And if even a force like the Taliban, which is in a number of issues quite retrogressive and reactionary, but waged a progressive struggle against US imperialism, if even the Taliban can unite the people against the imperialists, then damn, as communists, we better be able to get our act together and do that. Okay, so let's talk a bit more just about the state of surveillance in the US and how some of the stuff that we're seeing that I just covered is a big paradigm shift actually for the US. Let me just take a sip of water. Now, when I say a paradigm shift, I want to be specific. What I mean is that the US ruling class has for a long time had a goal, a dream, a hope, a fantasy of having a totally surveilled society where every activity of everyone within it is surveilled. If you look at the early papers about the military put out about the internet and other things and CCTV, they thought this was the potential, that ultimately you can watch everything. On the other hand, the US ruling class has been pretty slow in rolling that out, and they haven't gone aggressively for it, even though there's been planning and debate about how to do this. So for example, if we go back to the Patriot Act, we see that this was a big shift from the 60s. In 70s of selective wiretapping of a lot of people and of surveillance of hundreds of thousands of anti-war protesters, this was all electronic communications are captured by the government. And that was a big change. And there was resistance to it and anger about it, but it was by and large with, oh, this isn't patriotic, it's un-American, it's bad, it's Bush's, Christian evangelical stuff pushing for this or something like that. But it's against the Constitution. It was largely limited to that, actually. And most Americans, while they protested a bit, were basically, most Americans didn't protest. Well, there were some protests. Most Americans were basically apathetic. Oh yeah, that's bad. Bush is fucked up. The wars are bad, but what can you really do? And there was a big anti-war movement, but in terms of mass and strong opposition to mass surveillance, it wasn't there so much. And even after the Snowden files released from the NSA revealed how much worse it was than even we knew, and that the government was always watching you through your camera, on your phone and your computer, and that all this stuff was being collected in everyone around the world. Even then, there was by and large apathy. Now, a small section of the anti-war movement was pretty keyed into this stuff, some of the libertarians, some communist groups, but average Americans were like, whatever. And even when WikiLeaks released Vault 7 that showed that the government can electronically control any car, for example, is one of many things that are in Vault 7, and arbitrarily accelerate different wheels to cause the car to either drive really fast into a tree and kill you, or cause your car to spin out on the highway, make it look like an accident. And even after the journalist who was investigating this died in a sudden instance of unexpected acceleration of his car, people didn't really care so much. And I think that's kind of the wrong way to put it. People cared, but they were like, what can you do? I mean, it's fucked up, but the government's doing some bad stuff, but also they're not really killing me or you, and if you keep your head down, you'll be okay, and they're killing people abroad, and that's fucked up, but I don't really know. And this was a common disposition. People knew about this. I mean, it was literally, there was a whole series of memes about my FBI agent or government agent watching me. Me gets left on read by boy I like again. Government agent who's reading all my text. Wow, when will she finally find love? People were making jokes about this. Or this one, posing for the government, watching me through my webcam. I mean, these were very common memes in like the 2016, 2017 era, where mass popular consciousness had kind of understood that we were being watched all the time, but people dealt with the fucked up situation with humor. And Snowden said about this, saying you don't need privacy because you have nothing to hide is like saying you don't need freedom of speech because you have nothing to say. It's pretty brutal, and it's true. And we know that the government was using this surveillance against people, against prominent people in the society, to keep people in line, to blackmail people, etc. And Whitney Webb, in her research on the state of the US state and blackmail, has repeatedly emphasized that with mass surveillance, the need for someone like Epstein to get blackmail on everyone is much less. And with AI, you can always just make a video of someone doing something fucked up. So with all of that, really until the last few years of the Epstein files and the rollout of the data centers and everything else, people weren't really protesting and pissed off in the way they are now. There's been a big sea change in the amount of anger and the amount of protest and rage Americans have against repression. And I'll show you all shortly, but there's new groups and like all over the country constantly springing up fighting against these data centers. Now, actually, these plans for surveillance, and not just for surveillance, but for surveillance as part of a broader system of population control. These have been around for a long time. And I want to be clear about that. Actually, if you go back to Bentham in this discussion of the panopticon, the idea of a prison set up with like lights shining down into all the cells, and you can never tell if there's a guard in that tower or not because the light's shining so you can't see. You're looking up and you're blinded by it, kind of like I'm blinded by these lights right now. The idea was that prisoners would always basically behave because they didn't know if they were being watched or not. So they would behave as if they're being watched. And Foucault, despite all of his postmodern stuff and political limitations, talks about some of this stuff in his writings on Bentham and the Panopticon. I think it's worth reading into some of his better writings. But that's very literally the paradigm that the government references. They talk about that if people are always feeling like they're being surveilled, they're terrified of this. And they act accordingly because they always could be memed or watched by the government or laughed at by their peers or whatever. And even in Black Star, Mos Def and Talib Kweli back in '99 talk about this and the impact it has on the society. Like, what's the line? They're basically like, we're just well behaved because the camera surveys most of the things we think, do, or say. And if that was the case in '99, now in 2026, it's so much more. The ruling class isn't unaware of this. Actually, in the 70s, the NSA was debating setting up a system of surveillance and control, especially in the inner cities, after all the rebellions, especially amongst black people in the US against racism and segregation and so on. The NSA wanted to have a system that monitored 25 million Americans in inner cities, that put basically shock collars on them to zap them if they went out of their approved areas. That was literally debated in the NSA. And then the question was, if this was going to be implemented to limit more and more people's objective freedom, how do you get them to believe they're still free while they're constantly surveilled and shocked and kept in place? And they said, well, objectively, a lot of residents in inner cities are already basically prevented from doing much that's free. They don't have economic means to travel so much. There's, faced intense policing, et cetera. So we could give them the subjective illusion of freedom. How? Well, with electronic enhancement of their reality. You can see here, this is in a book from 1978, talking about NSA discussions in the late 60s and early 70s, the ideas in embryonic form of a society on their smartphone all the time. Subjective freedom, objective constraint. And that's the paradigm with surveillance. The ruling class is pretty clear in their internal debates about it. And hence why people are calling colloquially the rollout of surveillance the digital prison. And that's really what they aim to do. Now, of course, the digital prison by itself is not enough to keep people in chains. You need the constant threat of repressive force and serious repressive force against some people to be made examples of. We saw this with the protesters in Minneapolis who were killed, Alex Peretti and others, but we also see this with the prairie land sentencing. People who were protesting outside an ICE detention center were all labeled as terrorists and got absurd sentences. Here's a statement about them. You see at the bottom, Daniel got sentenced to 30 years in prison. He wasn't even at the protest. What did he do? He moved some zines. He moved some zines criticizing ICE and was sentenced as a terrorist under the new domestic terrorism laws that were rolled out by the Biden administration after January 6th. He was sentenced as a terrorist to 30 years in prison for moving zines. This is the sort of thing and the sort of high-profile case that's meant to tell everyone, you step out of line, you will be taken away for life. Democratic rights don't matter anymore. Now, I'm not saying that we live at present in a fascist society, and we'll come to the difference between bourgeois democracy and fascism shortly, but we are very, very clearly heading in that direction. And the January 6th example is so important because we know January 6th now was definitively staged and carried out by law enforcement. I'm not saying some Trump voters didn't have like a riot after their sports team lost, but the actual entry into the Capitol building was guided by FBI agents. There were no Capitol Police deployed to stop people from getting in, basically, and the whole thing was carried out with a clear and expressed intent by the state to roll out laws around domestic terrorism, such that Americans without a tie to a foreign terrorist organization can be labeled as a terrorist and tried under the laws that came out after 9/11. Both parties have been supporting this. Trump said he was against all this stuff on January 6th, blah, blah, blah. He pardoned a few people, but then he's sentencing people protesting against ICE as domestic terrorists, using the same mechanisms that the Biden administration created. So no real reprieve from this general trend is coming with Democratic electoral victories. And that's very important to be square about because this is the agenda of the bourgeoisie overall. The exact branding and flavoring of it will vary one administration to the next, but the basic line of more repression and surveillance, there's continuity on, and the scale and pace of it is escalating in line with the rise of domestic protests and popular resistance, and directly proportional to the decrease in the status of U.S. imperialism globally, both of which are happening very quickly. More domestic unrest and falling status of U.S. imperialism. So this sentencing of the prairie land people, of the prairie land protesters, it's just one of many things to come. But it's a landmark case. And I think looking back on it a few years from now, people will say this is an inflection point where a precedent was set whereby basically pretty mundane domestic protests and things like making zines and so on are going to be labeled as terrorism. And the conditions under fascism, which we'll get to in a second, are very different than under bourgeois democracy. It's still a form of rule by a tiny, parasitic, capitalist class ruling over the vast majority of people, but the ability to organize openly is much less. But that also means that a whole section of the population that enjoyed basically freedom to organize and believe in the illusions of liberal democracy will face the same sort of repression that only previously communists faced, and radicals and revolutionaries and so on under bourgeois democracy. So we'll get into that a little more in a little bit. But let's talk about the rollout of Flock briefly. I already mentioned a little bit, but it's helpful to see the visuals of how much this stuff has been rolled out in the last 2 years to get a sense of how quickly things are moving right now. There's some nice music. This is just in Ohio. And Ohio, not coincidentally, is one of the states with the most data centers, and there's a lot of concern about popular resistance to them there. There's also sizable manufacturing centers there and a lot of working class people. So Ohio, though, is not atypical. This is Atlanta, the most surveilled city in the United States, where, according to some reports recently, people went through and looked through all the Flock cameras, you cannot walk on a single street in Atlanta without being surveilled by a Flock camera now. Notice up top that's 6,300 cameras in the greater Atlanta metro area. If we compare that to New York, New Jersey area, we can see even zoomed out fairly far, we're at about 2,620 flock and a few other similar corporate entities that have similar cameras. These are on roads. Nominally, this is to prevent violent crime. Flock is actually used in the pre-crime screening that the government now does. But it's not just on roads, it's also on bike paths. And as I mentioned earlier, on playgrounds. And there was a huge outrage actually in Atlanta because one of the flock cameras was pointed directly into a children's gymnastics center. So some pretty creepy and disturbing shit happening all around the country. Someone posted this flock camera on the bike path, and it went very viral on social media. People are like, what the fuck is on a bike path? Flock was so freaked out by the popular backlash, they actually replied in the comments and said, oh, this is just to prevent violence that could happen there on the bike path. What? You have an AI rigged up AI rigged up camera broadcasting and surveilling everyone who goes by to prevent violence. It tells you a lot how the ruling class sees the population, that anyone is a potential threat and a potential terrorist. And if we look at the data centers being rolled out around the country in the last 2-3 years, here they are. Now you'll note that the vast majority of the 7,000 plus data centers that are being built or planned around the country are not officially reported because they're so unpopular. Because these big data centers, they destroy whole neighborhoods. And so a huge number are only being rolled out we only know of them via community reporting. People saying, holy shit, they flew that helicopter across our land with the big electromagnet on it to survey the aquifers. And now we know a data center's coming. Or, oh hey, the town had a secret meeting with people, government had a secret meeting with people from an AI company, and someone leaked it actually to us, and so now we know. But if you see these 7,000 community reported, that's scary. But on the other hand, that should be a promising sign. That means that all across this country, amongst many sections of the population who basically just wanted to live the American dream before this point, people are now organizing at a grassroots level against data centers. I mean, that's unprecedented levels of organization and resistance that's happening to this rollout of fascism. In order to roll out the type of fascism the US ruling class wants, an automated surveillance system, they need these data centers. And there's tremendous resistance to them. So that's a very hopeful thing, actually. So why all this now? Well, as I already noted, the status of the US ruling class is in decline. And while it's in decline globally, in order to maintain something approaching their rate of profit, and in order to maintain something close to, even if not that close to, the standard of living, or maybe it's better to say, in order to prevent the standard of living from totally collapsing for them and for a section of the upper stratum of the petty bourgeoisie, they have to make up the profits lost globally somewhere. And especially they're going to try to make that up here, through pressing the people more here, through getting sections of the population to accept a lower standard of living and a collapsing standard of living, and so on. And in this situation, they feel very threatened. So before getting into all that, let's talk a little bit about a Marxist understanding of the state and democracy. Quick question, a show of hands. How many of you saw that little photo op of Hassan Piker on the train reading State and Revolution, What Is to Be Done? Yeah, so Hassan's sitting on the train reading What Is to Be Done. Hassan Piker, is one of the biggest frauds in US politics. He's pretends to be for socialism, and yet he backs basically every Democratic candidate, and really is essential to justifying the Democratic Party. And then What Is to Be Done is a polemic against people like Hassan Piker, who have all these illusions about the bourgeois state. And it's somewhat particular to the Russian context with the Tsarist autocracy, but we won't get into all of it. The reality is that the state, once it arises, and it arises relatively recently in human history, it arises with the rise of classes, it exists to keep the oppressed class in chains and to keep class antagonisms in check. So just to be clear, depending on where you draw the line, human beings have been around for 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 years. Classes, as far as we know, based on the best available archaeology and anthropology, have been around for a few thousand years, maybe 6,000, 7,000 years. So classes and this type of class inequality in human society is a very new phenomenon. It arose under certain particular historical conditions, and it will eventually actually be overcome. It's very important to keep that in mind because our lives are so short, it's easy to believe the present is all there is. But once the class society develops, there's a need for a state. The state is not a neutral entity, unlike people who believe in the promise of social democracy. Those people hold this illusion the state's a neutral entity. The state preserves and maintains the class rule of the dominant class. Under capitalism, that means the state protects the interests of the capitalist class. And in the US, because of our, imperial chauvinism, we generally are totally ignorant of the reality of other capitalist societies, where social democratic parties not only were in power, but actually oversaw some very brutal repression, like the Social Democrats who led the counter-revolution in Germany in 1919, or like the French Communist Party that led and was at some of the forefront of the repression in May '68 in France. So a lot of the social democratic illusions that exist, which will grow as we move more towards fascism, are like, oh my God, we got Zoran, yay, it's so great, we can win things. There's some free childcare now. Or, oh my God, there was a big electoral victory and one of the candidates said she's a communist, and that means that everything's gonna be better now, and we'll have a sweeping victory of the democratic socialists, and then everything will be good in the US. These are illusions. Illusions which a section of the bourgeoisie will promote to hide the monstrosity of the bourgeois state and convince a section of the population who might otherwise turn to revolutionary organizing to believe that we can resolve our problems through the ballot box. Do you believe the people who are carrying out the genocide in Gaza, and the US bourgeoisie is, they're working with their little Israeli ethno-settler enclave to do it, but the US bourgeoisie is carrying out that genocide. Do you believe they're gonna let people vote their way to freedom? I mean, you gotta be pretty naive to think that. The government that's killed how many tens of millions of people since World War II, that has carried out how many coups against Latin American countries since World War II, that's did 9/11, the US government that did with Israeli government 9/11, do we think they're afraid of killing American citizens? Do you think, they'll let American people vote their way to freedom? It's an illusion. And the state, as we see very clearly with this rollout of surveillance, will be integral to the repression of any revolutionary effort. And the state offers no hope in terms of elections fundamentally transforming the society. You just can't vote your way out of this thing. So as Engels says, the state is a product of society at a certain stage of its development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it is split into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. So this then brings us to the question of, if we're heading towards fascism, what's the role of democracy in a capitalist society? What are we maybe moving away from as we're heading towards fascism? And there's a great quote from Fred Angst, who we just had speak at an event recently. Within the so-called public domain, i.e. the political institutions that serve capitalism and coordinate and mediate between diverse interests among the capitalists, the dominant organizational form is often a multi-party parliamentary system. Since capitalists compete with one another over power and markets, their interests are not consistent with each other. Thus, the core principle of bourgeois democracy under capitalism, under what is actually the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, is to maintain the fundamental characteristics of shareholding. That is the principle of $1, one vote, in which lesser money is ruled by greater money. The parliamentary system is thus, in reality, a mutually restraining kind of democracy of the dollar. The independence between the capital interest groups determines their particular independence. This is the economic foundation of the multi-party parliamentary system. Now, what Fred is highlighting here is that basically you have a system where different capitalists are always in competition with each other. And they use the state and the electoral system that exists in a bourgeois democracy to compete. And they, based on Citizens United and everything else, we really know it's $1, one vote. The capitalists decide how the society's run through the elections. And who did Zoran meet with right after he won? Anyone know? Famous son of a billionaire, himself a billionaire. That's right, Alex Soros is one of the first people Zoran met with, the son of George Soros and heir to the Soros fortune and the Open Society. One of the biggest members functionally of the US bourgeoisie, who is the biggest donor to the Democratic Party, consistently, who has been involved in color revolutions all over the world, and who supports the shift to kind of more of a social democratic veneer for US society, at least in some wealthy cities like New York. Now, other sections of the capitalist class, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of them in a moment, want to go towards fascism. And in order to do so, and when they do go towards fascism, they may significantly need to disenfranchise and even repress another section of the bourgeoisie who wants more bourgeois democracy. This is why we see the Trump administration saying, hey, Tucker, he might be a terrorist. Sebastian Gorka, who oversees a lot of Trump's anti-terrorism stuff, said Tucker might be a terrorist. I'm not saying Tucker is a paragon of bourgeois democracy, but he's been opposing some of the key repressive mechanisms the Trump administration's pushing for, and he's been a critic of the genocide in Gaza. But also, I can imagine we'll see, and the Trump administration has been pretty clear about wanting to do this, even if they don't do it, others will in the future, dismantling of Soros's network of influence in other sections of the bourgeoisie who are less inclined, at least right now, to go towards fascism. This is why the focus on the funding of all the left liberal NGOs has been such a big thing, because those are integral to the electoral machinery that supports the section of the Democratic Party that prefers to keep things bourgeois democratic. But we need to be clear, we can see this with Elon Musk, who has, for a very long time been a very reactionary right-wing troll, that the party that the divides really between bourgeois democracy and fascism don't neatly map onto Democrat and Republican. And actually, it could be the case, as we saw in the Biden administration, that a lot of new measures that pave the way to fascism get rolled out by a Democrat. Okay, with this understanding of the state and bourgeois democracy, at least somewhat grounding us, there's a lot more to be said about it. Lenin wrote a whole great book about it called State and Revolution. But with this understanding somewhat grounding us, we can go forward to talk about fascism. Because oftentimes people contrast fascism with democracy. And there's a certain truth to that. Bourgeois democracy and fascism are distinct forms of class rule. But the idea that people often have is democracy is this really great thing, the rule of the majority, and fascism is like dictatorship and it's bad. Well, fascism is certainly bad, but as we know, it's not like under the US bourgeois democracy, the masses have the ability to dictate their lives or really freedom to make major decisions about the society, even when the vast majority of people oppose something like the Iran war or support something like the release of all the Epstein files, they don't get done. That's because the bourgeoisie is the class that's in power, and as Fred noted in his quote, bourgeois democracy is a form of dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So as I just mentioned, the bourgeois state keeps the oppressed classes in check, but it also regulates contradictions within the ruling class. Fascism is another form of class rule. It's another form of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie over the vast majority of the population. And it's adopted basically exclusively in times of crisis and counter-revolution. Times when the bourgeoisie is dealing with immense internal and or external pressures. As we noted right now, the external pressures on the US bourgeoisie are very intense, and the internal ones are growing. And as I just said, referencing Musk, the divisions in the bourgeoisie really don't map very neatly onto Democrat versus Republican. The big corporations actually hedge their bets in every election. They also will switch which party they donate to more than the other one, back and forth. And the parties themselves wildly change their positions every few elections based on the shifting sentiments of the populace and the needs and aims of the US ruling class. Just go back and look at the Republican discourse around immigration under Bush. It's a very different discussion. Okay, let's look at some of the discussions, and I think a really foundational text on fascism from a Marxist perspective, which is Dimitrov's discussion of it at the Comintern Congress in 1935. Now, Dimitrov was the head of the Comintern, the Communist International, the Third International, for a while, and he was basically the leading force in it in rallying the communist parties around the world to fight against fascism and understand it as something really unique and different than bourgeois democracy and a unique threat to the people of the world. There was a series of different shortcomings the communist parties, including Dimitrov himself, the communists in this period, including Dimitrov himself, made, but still this definition and breakdown of what fascism is very helpful. He says, comrades, fascism in power was correctly described by the 13th plenum of the Executive Committee of the Communist International as the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. It is a government system of political gangsterism, a system of provocation and torture practiced upon the working class and the revolutionary elements of the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, and the intelligentsia. Fascism is not a form of state power standing above both classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as Otto Bauer, for instance, has asserted. It is not the revolt of the petty bourgeoisie which has captured the machinery of the state, as the British socialist Brailsford declares. No, fascism is not a power standing above class, nor the government of the petty bourgeoisie or the lumpen proletariat over finance capital. Fascism is the power of finance capital itself. It is the organization of the terrorist vengeance against the working class and the revolutionary section of the peasantry and the intelligentsia. So we can see from this definition, we're not yet in fascism. We're not seeing open terrorist violence against the working class and the peasantry overall. Now, the ICE attacks against protesters in Minneapolis, it's heading in that direction. But we got to remember, bourgeois democracy is a brutal system. I mean, they murdered the Panthers under bourgeois democracy. They killed MLK under bourgeois democracy. They killed Malcolm under bourgeois democracy. They repressed and murdered the American Indian movement, AIM, under bourgeois democracy. Not to mention all the strikes they broke with violent means throughout the history of this country. So there's a common tendency on the left in the US in particular to say repression is fascism, but then you're saying bourgeois democracy isn't repressive. So we have to look for a form of class rule that dominantly responds to mass protests and movements with open terrorist violence, just open gunning people down in the streets and arresting everyone. We're not there yet. And this is very important because fascism is a basically innovation the bourgeoisie develops to resist the revolutionary movements that arise. That's what Dimitrov is saying here, that faced with intense revolutionary struggle domestically, the bourgeoisie came up with a new way to repress it. And so if you look at actually the fascist movements of the 30s, in particular, the Nazis in Germany, the Italian fascists under Mussolini, and the Japanese fascists, they formed what was called the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was a joint pact to eradicate communism from the face of the earth. And any sort of fascist movement that has real mass support always frames itself in opposition to some revolutionary force. But the bourgeoisie can kind of develop a form of fascist class rule in the modern day and age without so much in the way of a strong movement to support it. That's what they're trying to do right now. It's harder for them, but they're hoping people like these ICE thugs and some of like QAnon conspiracy theorists online are enough of a base that they can roll this up. They're struggling because a huge section of the MAGA base is not accepting this. And there's a longer discussion to be had about the subjective formation of fascism and how they're trying to craft it in the US. I'm not going to get into so much of that. I want to actually talk more about who are the big sections of finance capital in the US bourgeoisie who supports fascism. It's changed a bit, but there's been some who have been pretty consistent supporters, like literal vampire Peter Thiel. This is from a few years ago. He said in a podcast interview, I don't think we're ever in a cyclical world, but there are certainly parallels in the US in the 2020s and to Germany in the 1920s. Liberalism is exhausted. One suspects that democracy, whatever that means, is exhausted. We have to ask ourselves some questions very far outside the Overton window. This is the same Peter Thiel who, when asked if the human race should continue, said, and hesitated. And then when asked again, he said, it's a complicated question. This is a man who would rather kill the vast majority of humanity and just have AI
power robots that serve him than have all the unwashed masses potentially revolting against him. Now, Thiel has been a long time fascist. He grew up in German Southwest Africa before it was Namibia, where, for those of you who don't know much about the history of that country, I would highly recommend you read Thomas Pynchon and his novels about it. He covers it in V, his first novel in Gravity's Rainbow. His argument basically is that the fascist ideology that arose in Nazi Germany really got developed in German Southwest Africa. They carried out a genocide there after the German government faked a gold rush there and got a bunch of Germans to move there. Then they did a massacre of the indigenous African population there. And then this mentality, a lot of these people went on to be very prominent members of the Nazi Party. And his argument, Pynchon's argument in his novels, is basically that mentality then was brought in by the American bourgeoisie, and we can see a real cultural continuity between them, at least a section of the American government, who was basically like Nazism, and a lot of them were brought in who were little Nazis through Operation Paperclip, and Nazi Germany. But long after Nazi Germany fell in German Southwest Africa, they kept dressing in Nazi uniforms and doing Nazi salutes. Those S's on their little trumpets are the lightning bolts from the SS. This is a typical youth group in German Southwest Africa. And here's the school that Peter Thiel went to in the 70s and 80s, and that is a Nazi flag with a swastika there. Now, he grew up in a Nazi country doing Sieg Heils in his childhood. So he's been a fascist his whole life. And he was part of, he came up in PayPal. He's part of what's called the PayPal Mafia. Him and other people from the PayPal Mafia went and pitched to In-Q-Tel, that's the CIA's funding arm, the idea of Palantir, this kind of way to integrate all the surveillance into the government, be a tech company that works better with the NSA, and build out this post 9/11 surveillance infrastructure. And he's a section of very important finance capital that funds now a huge number of the startups. And if you think about all the crazed tech startup CEOs and their insanity, they make a little more sense when you realize they've got to go beg Peter Thiel for funding. But why do others, not just these crazed people like Musk, and Thiel, who grew up in apartheid societies and so on, why are others turning to fascism? We've already said, basically, they're facing this, the US bourgeoisie is facing this unprecedented crisis, as shown with the Iran war and the rise of China. The stuff Thiel's been saying for a while sounds more appealing. Hey, you want to beat China? You want to not lose the Iran war? We got to really get the domestic population in shape. Then we can make enough bombs and missiles and nukes to rule the world. They're deeply worried about the domestic instability, as I already said. And the economic problems are very, very, very severe. Trump let the cat out of the bag where he said the other day, if the Iran war had gone on a couple more weeks, we would have had a global economic depression worse than the Great Depression. He just said it. That's his own advisor's assessment, that the global economy was teetering on the edge, may already be. This whole SpaceX IPO is basically a cash out. Everyone who bought into it amongst the common people, they were the exit liquidity for Musk and everyone else, all the investors, to get out. And the stock is crashing. And there's basically a lot of indicators, as we covered in our last event, the new Great Depression, that we're hit in basically the peak of the economic cycle, and we're heading into a major economic crash. And any major economic crash brings, sometimes more immediately, sometimes more slowly, a real radicalization of the people as their living standard plummets. And so the bourgeoisie is supporting fascism to deal with these external and internal threats. We've already been over this, but just to restate it. A huge section of the ruling class who previously felt bourgeois democracy was very good and helpful for their interests is now saying, this isn't working. The population's getting too unruly. We're losing ground globally. We need to do something. I don't want to lose my super profits. I don't want to lose some of my money. What if then someone else gets a bigger yacht than me? What if those Chinese businessmen gobble up my market share in South America? Well, Mexico, that's supposed to be our backyard. That's what they're saying. And China's making inroads there? Maybe Thiel has a point. Thiel's one of many. I'm using this example. He's not necessarily the cutting edge, but he's a prominent ideologue of fascism. So So let's talk about those external threats in more detail. The first is the decline of the US empire relative to other powers. I mean, other imperialist powers. The post-World War II era order was set up where the US was the top dog. Now, the relative gap between the US and even its allied imperialist powers like Japan and Germany has shrunk. But also China as a major strategic rival and Russia as a rival, not quite at the same level as China, but still as a powerful rival, have gained a lot of ground in many fields against the US. And I'll get into this a little more, I'll show a few more details, but I'll go through our main points here. China in particular is an unprecedented challenge for the US ruling class on every level. The Cold War against the social imperialist Soviet Union, nothing in comparison to the way in which China is beating, as you saw with that graphic I showed earlier, the US ruling class in basically every relevant metric of economic might. The US alliances that have been so integral to the post-World War II order of US dominance of the globe are weakening and breaking down, especially with the EU. And a whole bunch of regional oppressed countries and US allies and vassals are less loyal and less malleable. Okay, on the first point, let's look at a little hard data. This is a breakdown of share of nominal world GDP, in nominal terms. These figures, they're not adjusted for purchasing power parity and so on, but just gives you a rough sense. This chart goes from the 1960 to 2012. It's actually, the gap has closed more since then. China and nominal GDP is bigger than the US now. But look at that gap. Look at that gap closing. It's a huge decline. And there's some other interesting trends in there, like Japan kind of growing a lot and then shrinking a bit relative to the US and so on. But you can see how much weaker the US is, from 38% of the world's nominal GDP down to 22%, and less now. A little ice in my water. And the US GDP was so big because not just the US economy was so big, but the US GDP was so big because of all the ways in which it had access to the oppressed countries and their markets. It could pull resources, it could have cheap manufacturing abroad, it could just get very lucrative deals and buy products very cheaply from oppressed countries. All those relations of power getting weaker, some of them breaking down more directly, are expressed in this shrinking share of global GDP. Now, if we look at defense industrial capacity, we see that actually China has surpassed the US in a huge number of key metrics, basically everyone on this table. But also we can see that Europe is close to the US in a number of metrics and in some superior to the US, and that Japan is close in a few, especially motor vehicles produced. But also that India, an oppressed country, has a significant base, which is partially under the US control, but China has some influence there, Russia has some influence there, and obviously Russia has some real power too. All of this just shows the US is not the top dog in unprecedented global hegemony. The numbers here, they show the US is still a very powerful country, but it's not a unipolar force that has no real peers, no real rivals. And this is very different because the world order that was set up post-World War II, and then was especially, like after the fall of the Soviet Union, consolidated and transformed in some new ways after 91, was based on the US being the sole power, the sole big power. That's just not the case. Okay, to look at the challenge of Chinese imperialism, it's helpful to go to what Congress said. There's this big report in 2023, bipartisan committee in the House, that talked about basically the threat of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't want to say China because of Taiwan and because of all like the US state groups they sponsored, like Falun Gong, that are like, oh, we're not fighting China, you're fighting the communists. But this is their competition with the Chinese ruling class and the Chinese imperialists. In this report, we see, and I'll have to turn back to read it, without remedial action, the United States risks ceding the global battleground for investment and development leadership to the People's Republic of China. Without a massive overhaul in 2023, they said this would happen. They were fucked. But they would lose to China unless everything about the US economy was changed. There were these big plans that were drawn up. And this is even more striking. They say, never before has the United States faced a geopolitical adversary with whom it is so economically interconnected. The United States now has a choice: accept Beijing's vision of America as an economic vassal, or stand up for our security, values, and prosperity. With the Trump administration deciding that the economy should be OnlyFans and Polymarket, how do you think this competition with China is going? Yeah, the US is quickly headed in a direction stated somewhat hyperbolically here as heading towards being a Chinese vassal. Now, I don't think that the US will be entirely a vassal with China, but the economic dependence the US has on Chinese manufacturing is very, very significant. The US ruling class feels that pressure, and they feel China gobbling up market shares around the world, and they know, therefore, they need to change things. We'll talk a little bit more about China gobbling up market shares in a minute, but if they don't do that, they're fucked. And instead, they went all in on Polymarket. Now, with the EU, it's been striking to see the conflict raging between the US and EU allies. Denmark was ready to blow up runways in Greenland if the US invaded. This whole invasion of Greenland thing was a really, really serious diplomatic spat with the EU. How confident do you think the EU bureaucrats and capitalists feel about the US supporting them if the US is saying we're going to invade Greenland and take it from you, and who gives a fuck what you do? Not very. That's not really how you build a long-term partnership with a partner who's weaker than you, but not that much weaker than you. The EU, in response to some of these things, has set up a plan to build these mega mergers. I'm not sure it'll work out, but they're trying to build mega mergers of corporations across the EU to compete with Chinese and US monopolies in the EU and in global markets. And then a bit of a different thing, Spain, a NATO ally of the US, kicked the US military out of the Spanish bases that it uses. This is unprecedented in the history of NATO. And then the Spanish government went to China and signed new agreements. And this is different, actually, than somewhere like France and Germany wanting more independence. This is a poorer country in the EU saying, hey, we're going to go to China instead of the US. And we'll basically allow a huge amount of Chinese investment in our country, which will make us increasingly dominated by China, because that's a better option than going to the US. And France and Germany are working on setting up a military apparatus in Europe, and there's lots of obstacles to doing this, but to basically allow them to run the EU as an empire relatively on a peer level with the US, or at least, Russia and so on. This all sets up the ground for a much greater degree of autonomy for the EU. And this is what European leaders have been saying. We need strategic autonomy from the US and China. We cannot be a second-class bloc, imperial power, basically, to the US. And this is undermining US power globally, because the US-EU alliance has been integral. NATO's been integral to US power since World War II. And then, of course, there's all the regional allies, like Saudi Arabia, who has been basically flirting with the petro-yuan. And believe me, after this war with Iran, where the US basically was totally unable to protect Saudi Arabia, the Saudis have already made it clear to the Iranians they want to cut a deal with them. And the Chinese are looking to move in too. They already have been. Even if we go to the Western Hemisphere, we see that China's been building up a huge amount of infrastructure projects all over Latin America, what the US considers to be its backyard. And literally in the US's backyard, as far as the ruling class sees it, Mexico, a very, very long time functional vassal of the US state, Chinese EV manufacturers are dominating the market. It's one sign of how on the retreat the US is. If the US can't sell cars in Mexico, and Chinese capitalists are gobbling up that market share, not like some joint US capital, Mexican capital enterprise, the US is losing big time. A lot of companies are facing profitability crises as they lose market share, which means they need more repression, because how does the US ruling class ensure the stability of the domestic population? All these profits they're making around the world, they take a small section of those profits and they bribe a section of the US population. Better off unionized workers, office intellectuals, NGO employees, low-level bureaucrats in the government, they bribe them. not literal bribery, they give them higher wages. That's what Lenin talks about when he discusses the concept of labor aristocracy and how the petty bourgeoisie operate under imperialism. When all those people's standards of living goes way down, how do you think they're going to feel? Enthused to support whatever administration's in there, enthused to support the government as one administration after the next, their living standard collapses? No. And we look at China's trade with Latin America. In the last 20 years, the US is getting outcompeted. And actually, we look globally over the last 40 years. It's stunning, the scale of US corporate defeat. Now, some of these companies are exporting goods that are owned by US companies, but made in China, so that graphics can be somewhat misleading a little bit, but overall, this is the trend. And even the fact that US companies are making their goods they're selling to Africa or Asia or wherever in their biggest strategic rival shows their dependence on China, actually. Now, to tie this all together, there's a very, very, very interesting security memo that was published by the basically Chinese equivalent of the FBI and CIA all in one, right after Trump and all the CEOs visited China, where they basically said, look, the actual threat of the US to China is over. The phase in which the US could wage an offensive economically, and now obviously militarily after the Iran war against China, is over. There's no way the US ruling class can do that. They're in retreat against the Chinese advance. So the real question is just maintaining and managing the US decline. And remember, right after the visit, Trump said, America's in decline. It's a nation in decline. Trump admitted it. Xi Jinping said, I agree with you. This is the Chinese security services. Their view is, it's over. The US is lost. It's just like, we got to make sure they don't get too mad and have a meltdown and try to start a war with us or something. But let's be real. If Iran, a regional power, in 40 days smacked the US, and now the US has like no missile capacity, the US knows they don't have any bases that they can defend from Chinese missiles and bombs, which are much more advanced than the Iranians in a number of metrics, most metrics. The US military has a sense that they can't win if they try to fight a war to conquer China. So it's in this state of things that the US ruling class is feeling the pressure externally. And this is Trump citing the new Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty Germany signed after they were defeated in World War I and imposed heavy indemnities on Germany. And it was basically like a national humiliation for the country. Trump didn't really realize when Macron invited him to sign the treaty, the MOU with Iran in Versailles, the optics of it. But somehow the press did. I was trying to find a high-resolution photo. There was not a single high-resolution photo of the signing that I could find. There's these videos and clips and stuff, but there's no nice photos of him signing it. And people may have seen some of the funny memes about, like, this is the beginning of America's century of humiliation, which is like what China referred to the century of humiliation from the start of the Opium War to liberation in 49. But that's really what's beginning. And the ruling class has some sense of it. Trump, maybe not so much. So hopefully this makes a little more concrete the external factors and pressures driving the US ruling class towards fascism and hence contributing to this rollout of surveillance. Now let's talk about the specter that haunts. I'm referring, of course, here to the Communist Manifesto, the specter haunting Europe, which was communism and the communist revolt of the working class. But this is the specter that's haunting the US right now. As I already talked about in the last slide, this declining status of US imperialism means there's far less money to bribe the population domestically. And you can see this in the social malaise that it engenders. I mean, a lot of people just expected their kids would do better than them, economically, socially, et cetera. That didn't happen. And then, like, it really didn't happen now. And young people are like, oh, okay, like, what hope do I have? I mean, hence the rise of doomerism. And what incentive and, like, optimism do people feel for the future in a society where they know they're going to be a hell of a lot worse off, not only than their parents, but in 5 years, probably hell of a lot worse off than they were 5 years ago. And this cannot but radicalize a section of the population to see correctly the capitalists and the capitalist state as their enemy. And the collapsing US imperial system will cause a lot of problems domestically, but in particular, the collapse of the US dollar as an international currency can lead to major problems economically, and in particular, massive inflation if there's not as much demand for dollars globally as the yuan increasingly becomes internationalized. And that will mean all the dollars have to be used back at home, and that'll be, or more of them have to be used back at home, and that will cause a lot of inflation. And China has actually increasingly, since the start of the Iran war, been shifting and reducing its debts and various countries' debts to China, insofar as those countries are willing to, or as long as those countries are willing to denominate their debts in yuan. This is unprecedented. Normally, Chinese loans to other countries have been denominated in dollars. And since 2013, the Chinese ruling class has replaced the US as the biggest source of, and US banks really, as the biggest source of US dollar lending to a whole bunch of countries in Africa. But those loans came with strings attached, of course, that's how empires work. And so a lot of these African countries converted more and more of their economies to be part of the Chinese system and to be more dependent on China. Now those economies have been changed so much and are so compatible with the Chinese empire that they can actually pay the Chinese government back in yuans. And the Chinese government can pay them in yuans and not dollars because they do so much trade with China. They don't need to trade in dollars anymore because they don't need to buy US goods or European goods or whatever. Some EU goods are bought with euros, obviously, but a lot are bought with dollars. And so all these dollars are now potentially going to be repatriated to the US. And that's functionally a hell of a lot of money circulating around that wasn't in the US economy before. And you know, printing money, all else equal, means a lot of inflation. Very importantly, traditional political divides are breaking down in the populace. I mean, you see this with Republican support for Israel plummeting. You see this with a huge section of people no longer identifying with the Democratic or Republican Party. You see this with a whole bunch of stuff like the anti-Muslim rhetoric that was very common and essential in the post-9/11 era to rally people to the US government breaking down. We'll talk more about all these points in a second, but these are very important breakdowns that are happening in the system that the bourgeoisie has politically to keep the oppressed masses fighting each other. Increasingly, so much of the dissent in this country is being criminalized and even labeled as terrorism. And we'll go through all the designations now of new terrorist activities, like being against Christianity. It's getting pretty crazy. But before I do that, I just want to say this dragnet approach, it means that a whole bunch of things that Americans have been used to doing and saying, and one thing you can say for Americans, like, people are not afraid to state their opinion. Big mouths, you know, like, that's fucking bullshit. They can't do that shit. You know, people just say it. In a lot of other countries, it's not that way, actually. It's a overall good popular legacy, even if there's some imperialist arrogance and other things that come with it too. But people who previously would just voice their opinions, now they're being told, you can't do that. Shut the fuck up and get in line. Or maybe even you're a terrorist. People do not just passively accept that. And the ruling class, they see in every protest, in every strike, as Lenin, quoting a German minister, put it, the hydra of insurrection. This is from his lecture on the 1905 revolution. At any rate, the history of the Russian Revolution, he means the 1905 revolution here, and this is before the October Revolution. He gave it before the October Revolution. Like the history of the Paris Commune of 1871, teaches us the incontrovertible lesson that militarism can never and under no circumstances be defeated and destroyed except by a victorious struggle of one section of the national army against the other section. We got to split the repressive apparatus. It is not sufficient simply to denounce, revile, and repudiate militarism, to criticize and prove that it's harmful. It is foolish peacefully to refuse to perform military service. The task is to keep the revolutionary consciousness of the proletariat tense and train its best elements, not only in a general way, sorry, that should say but, that's a typo, but concretely, so that when popular ferment reaches the highest pitch, they will put themselves at the head of the revolutionary army. The day-to-day experience of any capitalist country teaches us the same lesson. Every minor crisis, such that a country experiences, discloses to us in miniature the elements, the rudiments of the battles that will inevitably take place on a larger scale during a big crisis. What else, for instance, is a strike, if not a minor crisis of capitalist society? Was not the Prussian Minister for Internal Affairs, Herr von Puttkammer, right when he coined the famous phrase, "In every strike there lurks the hydra of revolution"? Does not the calling out of the troops during strikes in all, even the most peaceful, the most democratic, save the mark, capitalist countries, show how things will shape out in a really big crisis? Now we see this in the protests, ICE protests. We see this even at Delaney Hall. We see this when there's a real strike in this country, not like a managed one-day strike where the union is coordinated with the capitalists and it's all kind of a release valve, but a real strike. And we shouldn't decry one-day strikes. I mean, if the workers are ready to go on strike and the capitalists have got to concede, okay, let's do a one-day strike, that's a good thing. But I mean a real pitched battle, of which there are a number that have gone on in the last few years in this country. We see in miniature this crisis, the repressive apparatus deployed, the surveillance brought out. We see how afraid the ruling class is. Do you think they would have deployed ICE the way they did against, a whole bunch of pretty ordinary, normal people in the US, not like serious revolutionaries? Do you think the US government would have deployed ICE the way they did to crush those protests if they weren't feeling afraid of what was going on? They were very nervous. They're very scared. And that's really essential to understand. This is from Ken Klippenstein, one of the, I think, best current reporters in the US. They're all outside of the big news outlets. This is from a Substack. Let them drive less. This is referred to let them eat cake. Energy CEOs in particular right now are hiring security at an unprecedented level. With elevated gas prices and heating prices, they are worried, and this is what one head of a security firm told Ken Klippenstein, they're worried about their Bastille moment. The storming of the Bastille is the key moment of the French Revolution. So the security officers are being told by the CEOs of big corporations, I need a lot more security, not just because I'm worried about a Luigi Mangione, but because I'm worried that people are going to rise up and I'm going to be taken to the guillotine. These people, the leading monopoly capitalists, they're afraid. They're afraid of us, and they're afraid of all the people of this country. These aren't things people say when they're feeling secure. You didn't hear them saying this, back in the 90s. They weren't worried about a Bastille moment then. In 2026, they're worried about it. That's why we have flock everywhere. And, we live in this kind of imperial presidency moment, which has nothing really to do with Trump. He's just a phenomena of it, where Congress basically is kind of always at a deadlock. So a huge number of the actual decisions about the policy and functionally the way the state runs, which is supposed to happen through legislation, now happen through, what are they called? Well, security memos from the president. What's the term? I'm just blanking on it for a second. Executive orders. And actually each administration, one administration to the next, going back since Nixon, has massively increased the amount of executive orders they issue. Trump has issued a series of national security presidential memos that instruct the executive branch and all the federal law enforcement and the NSA on how to fight terrorism. And there you can see a list. This list, some of it was used in our graphic for the event, of all the different things that are indicators of terrorism. And that means people should be screened for pre-crime. Anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, extremism on race, extremism on gender, hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on religion, hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on morality. And the security services are told to intervene and arrest people before they commit any violent political acts, which means before doing anything, even just for holding these views, you can now be labeled a terrorist. Again, this is scary stuff that the government's doing. It also means they are fucking terrified of the people of this country. That if they're worried about you being anti-Christian, they're going to label you as a terrorist and arrest you, maybe? I mean, is that the behavior of a ruling class who's feeling swell? They're sweating it. big time. The 2026 Homeland Threat Assessment was leaked. This is an internal document to the Department of Homeland Security. They had a whole series of things they're worried about. New possible sources of terrorism. These include opposition to Israel and anti-Zionism, but also class-based or economic grievances. So now just for fighting for better wages or complaining about low pay, you could be labeled a terrorist. I don't know if you all saw that guy in California who burned down like the toilet paper factory. No one was hurt in it. And he was like, you guys should have paid us better. And they also complained about Epstein class and stuff. They're labeling him a terrorist, and they're charging him under terrorism provisions. And they said his act of industrial sabotage basically is a fundamentally un-American activity and therefore is terrorism. It tells you where these things are going. And it's like every month they're adding a new thing that's terrorism. You no longer just need to be linked up to an Islamic group sponsored by Israel. Yeah, for those who don't know, ISIS and Al-Qaeda never attacked Israel. ISIS attacked Israel exactly one time and apologized for it. There's a lot more evidence that they were creations of Israel and the CIA, but that's basically all you need. A new thing also that they're warning about, the government saying, anti-technology and AI activism. Now they give this warning about violence, even though there hasn't been these acts of violence. They're going to happen. Someone's going to kill, a data center. A data center executive. And if you've seen some of the footage of these mass meetings, we'll watch them in a second, against the data centers, you'll get a sense of how this country's changing. A few days ago, cops showed up at a meeting against the data center, or public meeting in front of the town, officials, municipal officials. These cops showed up at this town meeting about the data center, and there was a guy who was speaking, and he spoke too long. He was a farmer in Oklahoma. He was complaining about the poisoning of his land and the dangers of the data centers. He had a big sheet he was reading off of. He read off the sheet, and they arrested him. They said, "You got to be arrested." So I just want to give this memo to just the board here that's hearing our public comment. I want them to understand how bad this is for the people here in this town. They let him give it to one person. They said, "You got to go right now. You got to leave right now or arrested." He said, "What am I being arrested for? What are you guys kicking me out for?" They said, "All right, you're under arrest. Let's go." And arrested him. This is a poor white farmer in Oklahoma. This is a person, and the conditions for farmers have been very bad in this country for a while. But a lot of people in rural America who might have supported Trump, or who historically, as petty proprietors, were often some of the strong base of consistent support the U.S. government could rely on. These were the petty proprietors. They had the so-called American dream. They've got a farm, or they're like a small business owner. They could sell their goods, maybe move up a little bit. They kind of believed in the whole system. Now they're being arrested for speaking too long at meetings, public meetings. I'll now pull up a meeting of this battle against these massive data centers that are 3 times the size of Manhattan that are being built in Utah, in Mormon country, sort of the heartland of really, I think it's proper to call it something of white settler ideology. Now the whole, every white person is just a settler, that sort of stuff doesn't make any sense, but Mormonism really was, as Huey P. noted in his autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, the sort of cutting edge during the period of Western expansion of reactionary ideology of white settlers. And, a lot of poor white people are definitely part of the popular masses in the US right now, but amongst the Mormons, there's been a real ideological hold on the Mormon population in Utah that's kept them very loyal to the US state and to capitalism and so on. And if you watch this meeting, and I don't want to paint with too broad brush, there's been some political movements there, but it's been muted. If you watch this meeting, you get a sense of what a section of the oppressed masses in this country who used to support the US state a decent amount are now starting to do. You'll get a sense of how much things are changing very quickly in this country.
After a contentious hour-long meeting, Utah's sprawling hyperscale data center is still on track.
Okay, enough! From now on, I will tell you, you continue. I have law enforcement here who will remove you from the meeting.
The 3-member Box Elder County Commission voted unanimously to approve the massive campus. The commission's vote allows the Utah's Military Installation Development Authority to create the project area, where it can offer an array of incentives to Shark Tank celebrity investor Kevin O'Leary. The vote took place in front of a packed crowd at the Box Elder County Fairgrounds.
For hell's sakes, grow up!
Thank you.
After multiple disruptions, commissioners left the stage to finish the meeting virtually. Commissioner Tyler Vincent spoke about the rights of landowners on this issue.
We need to realize and remember that everybody has property rights and that they can do what they would like to do with their property.
Before the vote, attendees rallied in support of ending the project. Around 40,000 acres on 4 different plots of unincorporated Box Elder County have been set aside for the project. The majority of the land is privately owned and is north of the Great Salt Lake. Another 2 parcels are on the west side of the lake. Those sections are owned by the Department of Defense and the Utah Trust Lands Administration. MITA projects must include military land, and state trust land must be included for the state to receive its share of its tax revenue.
One of the biggest deals, and I'm not exaggerating, in the history of the state of Utah.
That's MITA's Executive Director, Paul Morris.
The first part is 3 gigawatts of power.
Estimates for the project say that the first phase will require 3 gigawatts of power, nearly matching Utah's average statewide electricity use of 4 gigawatts.
That will grow into 9 gigawatts of power.
State supporters said water from the lake used by the data center will be treated and sent to the drying Great Salt Lake, which will likely hit a new record low after Utah saw historically low snowpack and unseasonably warm spring temperatures this year. MITA says the data center would use a closed-loop cooling system that continuously reused water. Since Thursday, the Utah Division of Water Rights has received over 400 protests over the water rights applications submitted for the project. HB 60, a new policy passed by state lawmakers this year, reins in the Division of Water Rights' ability to consider many of the issues raised in the protests and letters of concern. Under that law, the state engineer is not able to consider concerns handled by other state agencies like air quality, wildlife, and recreation. Commissioners did not hear public comment at the Monday meeting, saying that the public had been given the opportunity to comment at an April 22nd Box Elder County Commission meeting.
They didn't listen to us. They haven't listened to us. It was weak, and it was just really disappointing because these people that are in power, they really don't care what we want.
You know, I just want to be clear because I spoke somewhat imprecisely earlier. When I talked about the settler question, there's a whole strain of Marxism in the U.S. that says all white people are just settlers and therefore they're the oppressors and therefore they aren't working class, and that's why the revolutionary movements in the 60s and 70s failed, because they didn't realize every white person sucks. It's kind of a silly and juvenile thing, but it was somewhat popular a few years back. But of course, when people are moving westward and stealing land at gunpoint, they literally are settlers on other people's land. And it's a very different thing to be a poor white person who grew up in a society, you know, in the the late 20th and early 21st century, than to be living on the frontier and, you know, killing the indigenous people and so on. Anyways, just to clarify that point, my point is, though, that in Utah specifically, where the Mormon church is very powerful and ideologically very powerful, it's had a grip tied up with this whole ideology of westward expansion and American chauvinism and so on, even on the poor and oppressed masses. But the data center issue and the fact that they're literally going to be using, like, in a few years, 2 to 3 times the entire electricity consumption of the whole state just for these data centers has people very, very angry. They're going to lose their water. They're not going to have power. And it's not just in poor areas. I mean, wealthy areas are going to be screwed over by this too. In fact, in Lake Tahoe, which is like a vacation area for a number of very wealthy people on the West Coast, especially the California and tech bourgeoisie, they were just told they're not going to be able to have water because it's to be diverted to a data center. Or no, sorry, they're not going to have power because it's going to be diverted to a data center. I mean, it's insanity. And people across the board are very mad about it, large swaths of the society. And in fact, 7 out of 10 Americans oppose the construction of local data centers. And my guess is of that 20%, those who do somewhat favor it don't really know the basics of what it's like actually the data center built, or maybe are working a job where you would be working on the data center or something. And the opposition to this data center stuff, which is one popular movement, but it's an important one because it's cutting across traditional political divides and rapidly shifting some of the ideological formation in the US, is huge. There's more than one group a day formed against data centers. One political group formed today against data centers over the last 6 months. And membership in these groups has grown by 5 times. There's a huge, huge mass movement against this stuff. That's against a key piece of the infrastructure for surveillance and for this like fully automated AI digital prison that they hope to build. And fully automated, of course, we should be understood somewhat facetiously because they need people at a lot of different levels to make this stuff work. All this is happening in a situation where trust in the US government is very, very low, close to all-time lows. And my guess is now, this is from September of last year, after the Epstein files and the Iran war, my guess is the numbers now are much lower, actually. And the Trump thing and the promise to drain the swamp was sort of the last best hope to really reignite some popular support for the government after years of people's anger kind of bubbling up. And then for him to just go all in on protecting the Epstein clients and to just fight this war for Bibi, not just for Bibi, obviously, but a lot of people see it as a war for Israel. And Trump said it's a war for Israel, and Bibi said it's a war for Israel. So there's some truth to that too. It's really hurting Trump. And also, American support, not just for the government here domestically, is declining, but also for Israel, and therefore for U.S. foreign policy throughout the whole region. And for a long time, the U.S. empire has worked by farming stuff out to Israel. That's led to some contradictions because Mossad has blackmail on a bunch of American politicians and business leaders. And other problems arise from that too, because the Israelis have their own interests that are somewhat distinct, the Israeli ruling class from the U.S. ruling class. But farming things out to Israel is very effective for managing U.S. domestic political discontent. Literally, there's been papers for years that just say, leave it to Bibi. We'll let whatever fucked up, heinous stuff happens that the U.S. empire does, we'll have Netanyahu carry it out, basically, or to have him take the blame. And as public opinion for Israel is pretty high, it doesn't ripple back so much. That's changed. People have a very negative opinion of Israel now in the U.S. and of Netanyahu, and that's not going to go away. It's only going to get worse. And we've all just watched a genocide be streamed in 4K by soldiers who are gloating about it. And if we see what they're willing to gloat about, we can imagine what they're not willing to gloat about. And you can see in particular amongst young people, the support for Israel is much lower. Well, for older people and some members of the Republican Party, support for Israel is much higher. This is unfavorable views of Israel. So the higher percentage, the less favorable the view. But the reality is that these numbers, I think, don't even reflect how unpopular Israel is right now, because a lot of the polling is done amongst people who are A, registered voters, and B, likely to pick up their phone. And if you think about the people you know in your life or you see online who are really the biggest critics of Israel, a lot of them aren't registered voters and certainly wouldn't pick up a random phone call from a number they don't know. What's more, the Iran war, in a very short period of time, is the most unpopular war that responsible statecraft doesn't say war, it's a major conflict. The most unpopular war in US history. This war is more unpopular than the Vietnam War was at the end of the Vietnam War, when it was so unpopular, continuing the war wasn't sustainable. And Trump just started bombing again today. So you can imagine how popular that's going to be. And let's be square. The economic impacts of the war have just begun to hit the US. Oil prices have actually been artificially suppressed by the government, and they've been pumping out the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is just hitting rock bottom basically now. It's hitting below the line at which you can draw it out because there's some baseline that has to be maintained to keep the tanks and the caves and stuff working. So now the price of gas, but if the price of gas and energy goes up, then the price of everything goes up. It's all going to go up. And with the war restarting, it's going to go up more. And much like with the Nixon price controls in the 70s, when inflation started to pick up in the early 70s, the mechanisms by which the Trump administration has sought to keep prices down, and oil prices in particular down, when they do break down, and they will, just like Nixon's price controls did in the 70s, the eventual inflation will be so much worse. And we're on the cusp of that now. And if all this wasn't enough to convince you that the US ruling class is facing some major problems domestically, this is an article about the short supply of soldiers. The US military has faced a major recruitment problem, the worst really in the history of the volunteer army over the last few years. This means they don't have the troops to fight the wars, but also the troops are key for domestic repression. Whenever the protests get out of hand, what do? Send the troops in. People are saying on mass level, I don't want to go fight and die for Israel. I don't want to go fight and die for Epstein. I don't want to go fight and die for the pedophiles. And the supply problem that the military has, as they put it, supply problem, started before the Epstein files were public knowledge. This goes back 3 years. This problem's been going on. They remediated some of it with Trump coming in, like, oh, maybe got some more recruitment strategies, but after this war, do you think it's going to be better or worse? Worse. Now, in the face of all this, in the historic discrediting of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, there's a whole series of new political alignments the bourgeoisie is trying out to try to get their hands around the populace and to keep the populace supporting the American government and capitalism and everything else. We talked a little bit about some of this stuff with the Social Democrats and Zoran and other stuff, but they're not the only ones. Because in the face of this unprecedented crisis in the stability of the class rule in the US, a whole series of different sections of the bourgeoisie will try out different maneuvers. And the crisis of legitimacy is growing very intense. I'll give you just one indicator in video form. Tucker Carlson has left the Republican Party.
I would not support the Republican Party. There's no chance I would support the Republican Party. I'm not going to support the Democratic Party. I don't know what I'm going to do. But at this point, how could I or any American voter support a political party that's not loyal to the United States, that puts the interests of a foreign country above those of its own citizens? That's it's not possible to vote for people like that, and I'm not going to. And I think I voted Republican my entire life. I worked at Fox News, CNN, right, MSNBC. I've been a consistent defender for 35 years of the Republican Party. I mean, very consistent defender. But there's no defending this because it's immoral, and it's exactly the opposite of what a political party in a democracy is charged with doing, which is representing its own voters, its own citizens, its own nation, and they're not doing that. So no, I'm out. And if I'm out, then I think a lot of other people are out.
So what we see Tucker saying here is a fairly sophisticated maneuver to... We got a traffic jam going on, so unfortunately I was honking. What we see Tucker saying here is a fairly sophisticated maneuver to displace the blame for all the atrocities of the American empire onto Israel and a section really of the US ruling class that supports Israel and the Israeli ruling class, which there's a question, is the Israeli ruling class really a separate ruling class from the US? They're so integrated. Now they're going to integrate the military, the U.S. and Israeli military. So, yeah. They literally are doing that in the National Defense Authorization Act this year. So, yeah. But what Tucker's trying to do is basically blame this on Israel and then say, okay, so therefore the U.S. empire isn't guilty of the crimes it's committed. And the U.S. capitalist class aren't the problem. It's the party that sold the country to Israel. This sort of formulation will have some significant popular support. And now we're kind of going from the specter that's haunting the country to the efforts of the ruling class to misdirect that energy. And it's possible that Tucker, even though he's talking about democracy and representing the will of the people and so on and so forth, could, and I'm not saying he will, but he could, or others like him could, use the popular anger about stuff with Israel and everything else to not only prevent people from really seeing the true antagonism that exists with the capitalist society, with the ruling class, etc., but to actually rally to support fascism. I mean, after all, fascist movements need scapegoats. Now, I'm not saying this is the most likely thing here with Tucker personally. I'm not going to get into speculation about him. He's a pretty sophisticated political operator. My point rather is that if we sit by passively as communists, as revolutionaries, and do not work to do everything we can with this massive opening that's in front of us, the bourgeoisie will take advantage of it. They will rally people to fascism. They will rally people to social democracy. They will rally people to one form or another of imperialist ideology. Those are both forms of imperialist ideology. And they will preserve the stability of bourgeois rule in this country. We can't believe they're just a passive agent that has no activity and no capabilities. They very clearly actually are pretty sophisticated in how they operate. And so this basically brings us to our question, which is really the question Lenin spells out in this book, which is what is to be done? What do we do given all of this, the decline of US imperialism, the rise of fascism in this country, its potential rise, and certainly things are moving in that direction, the machinations by people like Tucker Carlson and the capitalists, other capitalists, he himself is a capitalist, the capitalists who back him. What do we do? How do we handle this situation? Well, this presentation's already been a few hours. I'm not going to give you a systematic breakdown of how to handle all aspects of it. Which more, let's just be clear, as MCU, I think we have some good ideas. We do not have all the answers. The answers have to be worked out both in light of the existing Marxist theory and its creative application, but they have to be worked out at the level of the mass movement. So we have some clarity. There's actually a lot of work that we have to do, and by we, I mean you here in the audience, I mean the people of this country, to figure out really how to make revolution in this country through the creative application of Marxism. But in looking at what is to be done, we can get some sense of what to do. I showed you here a tremendous number of huge outrages that are going on in the society and a tremendous amount of resistance to them, and then also a series of efforts, both by well-meaning liberal journalists and also by ruling class demagogues, to reframe and redirect mass outrage. So let's talk about, or let's look at what Lenin has to say. We would be politicians and communists in name only, as all too often happens in reality, if we failed to realize that our task is to utilize every manifestation of discontent and to gather and turn to the best account every protest, however small. This is quite apart from the fact that the millions of laboring peasantry, handicraft, rural artisans, etc., would also listen eagerly to the speech of any communist who is at all qualified. Indeed, is there a single social class in which there are no individuals, groups, or circles that are not discontented with the lack of rights and with the tyranny, and therefore accessible to the propaganda of communists, and to the spokesman of the most pressing general democratic needs? To those who desire to have a clear idea of what the political agitation of a communist among all classes and strata of the population should be like, we would point to political exposures in the broadest sense of the word as the principal, but of course not the sole form of this agitation. The ideal audience for political exposures is the working class, which is first and foremost in need of all-around and live political knowledge. And it is most capable of converting this knowledge into active struggle, even when that struggle does not promise palpable results. A tribune for nationwide exposures can only be an all-Russia newspaper. Without a political organ, a political movement deserving of that name is inconceivable in the Europe of today. In this respect, Russia must undoubtedly be included in present-day Europe. The press long ago became a power in our country. Otherwise, the government would not spend tens of thousands of rubles to bribe and subsidize the Kharkovs and the, I practiced this beforehand, the Mishurskis. And it is not, and it is no novelty in autocratic Russia for the underground press to break through the wall of censorship and compel the legal and conservative press to speak openly of it. This was the case in the 70s and even the 50s, 1870s, 1850s. How much broader and deeper are now the sections of the people willing to read the illegal underground press and to learn from it how to live and how to die, to use the expression of a worker who sent a letter to Iskra. Political exposures are as much a declaration of war against the government as economic exposures are a declaration of war against the factory owners. The moral significance of this declaration of war will be all the greater, the wider and more powerful the campaign of exposures will be, and the more numerous and determined the social class that is declared, and the more numerous and determined the social class that has declared war in order to begin the war. Hence, political exposures in themselves serve as a powerful instrument for disintegrating the system we oppose, as a means for diverting from the enemy his casual or temporary allies, as a means for spreading hostility and distrust amongst the permanent partners of the autocracy. In our time, only a party that will organize really nationwide exposures can become the vanguard of the revolutionary forces. Now, there's a ton here, so I'll break it down. First, in talking about the declaration of war here, he's not meaning literally it's time to go to war over whatever outrage or political exposure they show. Like, we wouldn't, do an exposure of a data center and say it's time to take up arms against the government. It's silly. Any sort of revolution has to be timed and planned and so on and so forth. His point is that by providing these exposures of all the outrages in the society, it's teaching the people how to fight just against the government, just like they learn how to fight against the capitalists through the strikes and through the economic agitation. And this is needed. If you don't train the workers how to deal with all the issues in the society, well, you're first condescending to them, because who's just a worker with no interest beyond the shop floor? I mean, you got to be pretty absurdly interested in the world to be like, yeah, things are fucked up in my workplace and I'll fight there, but who cares about the Epstein files? But also, as Lenin notes, there's a whole bunch of inconsistent allies of the ruling class. In Russia, the czarist autocracy he's referring to. In our case, the capitalist class. The intellectuals, the peasantry, etc. In our case, the petty bourgeoisie and the small business owners, the petty bureaucrat and the government. These people are an essential base of support for the government when it's stable. But their interest fundamentally isn't with the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks. Their interest of the small proprietors is not ever going to be protected by the Epstein class. Like George Carlin said, it's a big club and you're not in it. These people aren't in it. You think like the petty government official at the DMV or working in the FDA and seeing how none of the drugs are safe and none of the food is tested or the Environmental Protection Agency, like, do you think their interests lie with Jeff Bezos? No. But these people, a lot of them, casually support the government. So how do you win them over? You got to provide exposures of all the issues affecting them. And you got to train the workers to talk to them to win them over to the revolutionary cause. And you got to then wait for a crisis and then the right moment, strike while the iron's hot. This is what Lenin's talking about here. If the working class is not trained to be the advanced class, how do you lead the other classes? You understand all of their issues. You understand the data center outrages. You understand the problems of the small business owners being screwed over by Amazon and Walmart. You understand the religious oppression facing Muslims in this country. You understand the difficulties like small businesses owners who are immigrants face, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these things. And you understand the broad repression of democratic rights that's occurring now, that people across the political spectrum and from a whole series of different classes, groups, and strata will be opposed to. You understand all those things. And you provide exposures of all those things. And either they're already being talked about, and in our day, not so much in the newspapers, I mean, still somewhat in newspapers, but online, on social media. And then if you don't talk about them, people are listening to Tucker Carlson or the Salt Lake Tribune or, Hassan Piker about these issues, and therefore they're not listening to communists, or they're not being talked about, and then you're the first one to expose them. And then suddenly all these other ideologues come out and start talking about them, and you force the issue to reach a broader section of society. That's what Lenin's talking about here. And he says, until you can do this, you're not really a communist party. Now, at MCU, we've begun to do some of this through our production of agitation. But really what's needed is for groups around the country to take this up and to share experiences, to build out a whole apparatus capable of talking not about just a few issues like we can do right now, but about every major issue and protest going on in the country. And if you want to fight fascism, building out the organizational capacity to do that and building out the related movement to do that is the only way. It's the only way to really and effectively build a fighting force capable of defeating fascism. And then we can talk diversity of tactics. But until such a force exists, what we end up having happen over and over again is precisely what Mao described in Reform Our Study, which is people courageously and heroically fighting pitched battles against the oppressors, laying down their lives, but not being able to succeed in stopping the advance of the oppressors, of the capitalists, and certainly not being able to succeed in defeating them and breaking their power. And that's the task that ultimately lies before us, because the fight against fascism is inextricably caught up in the fight for proletarian revolution, for socialist revolution. And anyone who tells you otherwise is prettifying bourgeois democracy. Generally, those people aren't very good fighters against fascism, but even when they are, and sometimes they are, they seek to bring about a return to what we had in the 90s in this country, or something akin to it. That is a bourgeois society where the vast majority labor away for the benefit of a tiny minority. An empire that holds people around the world in chains. And I think we need to go back to the actually very famous song in the abolitionist movement, which is that none of us are free if one of us is chained. And that's a principle not just of literal slavery, but also of exploitation to the capitalist class. You know, if you are like slaving away your life, not as a slave, but as a wage slave, and have very little free time and have died 30 years earlier than, you know, a wealthy person, and you have to work 2-3 jobs, are you really free? Or if you are constantly unemployed and barely able to skate by on like an occasional side job and government check, or if your country is being bombed by imperialism, are you free? No. And the fundamental principle of proletarian internationalism is not a better life just for me to be comfortable and enjoy my commodities or, be a treatler, but rather that we stand with all the oppressed groups, classes, and strata around the world and seek to unite in all of their collective struggles for liberation, to ultimately overcome classes and overcome oppression itself. And that's not the end. That's communism. That's not the end. That's the beginning, really, of human society. Because can you imagine, just as in a very basic and embryonic way, if all the waste we had, surveillance, but all the idiocy of all of our society that we see all the time in the job, if all that waste didn't happen because of the social system we have where a few benefit and the vast majority labor, but instead if we all work together across the globe to do what was for the betterment of all of humanity, just imagine the potential. Billions of people working together. Just vaguely start to think about it. Because it's a lot to wrap our mind around. We can't say so much about what that would be like. We get some general sense. The potential, the creative potential of the people, of the world, is kept shackled. But communism is really the beginning of the unleashing of that. And that's what we're fighting for. Thank you. That's the end. Okay, so we'll do questions. I'll take a few at a time, call in 2 or 3 people, answer them, and then take more. 1, 2, 3. Start there.
Could you speak some more about, like, what is the nature of the relationship between the Israeli and American intelligence agencies in surveilling U.S. citizens, and then also how to understand the Israeli intelligence agency's surveillance of people like within the U.S. state and politicians and government officials?
The question was, can I speak more on the relationship between the Israeli and American intelligence services, and also the role of the Israeli intelligence services in spying on people in the U.S. state? This is a complicated topic. There's a lot here. As I see it, the Israeli intelligence agencies were really built up by the U.S. intelligence agencies to have a powerful and reliable ally and intelligence force in the Middle East, and to farm things out to them so that assassinations, spying, etc., could be carried out by Mossad without too much public backlash. But whenever you create something like that, that's powerful, influential, it can get out of hand. Sort of like the rabid dog getting off the leash. And for a very, very, very long time, Mossad has operated with a great degree of independence from the U.S. intelligence. So first, it's well known that basically the CIA will not take any gifts from Mossad. They don't trust anything. They don't let Mossad in a lot of their facilities. They basically, everything that Mossad gives the U.S. intelligence is always spying on them. That's what the CIA has said, actually. Second, American intelligence operations do not occur in Israel. If you read Seth Harp's book, he talks about how, The special forces don't do any intelligence operations in Israel. CIA doesn't do any intelligence operations in Israel. They do not spy on Israel. I don't know exactly when this arrangement came about, but if you go back in history, there's a series of instances where the Israelis gained a lot of leverage over American businessmen and the U.S. security services. Israel stole, for example, U.S. nuclear secrets. They used them to develop their own nuclear system, which of course the U.S. knew about, but they stole some U.S. nuclear secrets to do so. But they also then sold these nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War in exchange for getting some Jews from the Soviet Union to go to Israel. This really pissed off the American government. But the American government has been very afraid of reprimanding Israel. Actually, Nixon did a little bit, and then the Israelis threatened him with the Samson option. And he backed off. What's more, we know with Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, that he was integral in spreading the Promise software from Mossad throughout the entirety of the Fortune 500 companies, basically in the US. This gave Mossad a backdoor into the internal workings of basically the computer servers of all the big American companies. So they knew which CEO was doing what, with whom, who was sleeping with the secretary, who was sexually harassing the woman in the office, who was secretly gay, et cetera, which was a big deal in the 90s. It's not like today as much. I guess for a few CEOs, it'd still be a big deal, but whatever. But they also got a huge amount of corporate secrets, like corporate intellectual property and so on. And the US didn't do much. You know, if that had come out from, you know, a European ally, it would have been a different response. Now, a section of the US bourgeoisie supports and enables Israel doing this. I mean, people like Larry Ellison, the biggest donor to the IDF, he makes Oracle, which is integrated into all these, you know, corporate systems, all these government systems. He's basically part of the Israeli ruling class. Someone like Miriam Adelson, too, US capitalist, owns the Dallas Mavericks, but, you know, big casino magnate from her husband's casino empire, but is basically part of the Israeli ruling class. And this is where you, like, where is the line? Is the Israeli ruling class a section of the American ruling class, the US ruling class? I don't know. It requires some more granular analysis than I've done or than we've done in MCU. But we do know that, for example, the Epstein stuff, he was spying on and blackmailing US politicians. To what extent and for whom? I don't know. Was he principally loyal to Israel and Mossad? Was the CIA and NSA really controlling things and pulling the strings? I don't know. I mean, we know that Epstein was a Jewish supremacist. I mean, that's clear based on his emails calling all the, you know, a bunch of the, you know, non-Jewish cabinet secretaries with, oh, the Goyim, let them deal with the details, we'll make the money, etc. Yeah, now the ADL says that to make jokes about the term Goyim is anti-Semitic, which is like, you know, it's a slur against non-Jews. Now it's anti-Semitic to make a joke about that. It's pretty surreal what the ADL says these days. There's like if you look at their map, it's a side note, but they're of anti-Semitic hate crimes. It's like people said free Palestine. Wow. Okay. But to go back to the question about the Israeli intelligence and their blackmail and spying on US politicians, it's significant. I mean, like, Lindsey Graham is the biggest, I think, example. Like, basically everyone knows the guy's gay and into children. It's pretty obvious. He's not married. He goes to Disney World by himself. He's always seen there with young men. Israel basically doesn't have a bigger supporter in the US Senate than him. Maybe Ted Cruz. I don't know what Ted Cruz is into. He's the Zodiac killer, you know. But the extent and scale of that, to what extent that's Mossad versus the CIA farming it out to Mossad acting independently versus the CIA farming out to Mossad, it's hard to say. Some of those things we have a sense of. Some of them, it's kind of after the revolution you're going to learn. But certainly there have been historically some sharp contradictions between Mossad and the US intelligence. The really interesting question is, I think, 9/11. Namely, like, obviously Mossad was involved. For those who don't know a little bit about 9/11 stuff, there were a series of Israeli art students who were here in the United States. they were doing an art installation in the World Trade Center that involved the exit signs on the windows of the 96th floor or something of the World Trade Center. That was their art piece. There's just like documentaries about how cool their art was back then. These same Israeli art students, which is like the easiest thing to get someone on a visa for, because art students, you can fudge it pretty easily. Actually, the visa stuff for it's harder than the STEM stuff. We're seen dancing and filming the collapse of the Twin Towers. They were seen in advance, prepped and filming and cheering as it collapsed. They were reported, there was news stories that aired about it, then they were picked up by the FBI, interrogated, and then all deported on, their visas had expired, because they were held till their visas expired and then deported. There's a question here of how independently did Mossad act? Was the CIA involved in it? It seems likely the CIA was involved in it. The FBI seems like they were cut out. I don't know. There's a big series of questions there. But I think if you really dug into 9/11, and once we get some more of the files on that, when they eventually come out, and just in case it's not clear, I'm saying the US government, in coordination with the Israeli government, did 9/11. I think that's indisputable at present. And a whole bunch of big members of the bourgeoisie had advance notice. That's why they shorted the airlines that crashed into the towers and made a huge amount of money off of it, and so on and so forth. But all that is to say, the exact division of labor there would be quite revealing to what the relationship was actually like. And a section of the US bourgeoisie now wants to hang Israel out to dry. Take the fall. You got to have a scapegoat for this sort of thing. Okay.
There is a comment I think I see on the left with Blood in My Eye, George Jackson, that the U.S. has always been fascist since like Jim Crow. How do we actually analyze dispute that idea and break down actually how to get some an argument against that?
It's a great question. The question was, there's an idea, for example, put forward in George Jackson, who was a member of the Panthers, his book, Blood in My Eye, that the U.S. has always been fascist. And in particular, George Jackson refers to the incredibly brutal violence that the U.S. state and various, paramilitary organizations like the KKK have always brought to bear against Black Americans, Jim Crow South, et cetera. And the question was, well, what's the counter argument to that? And how do we clarify that's not the case? Well, the first thing is it's necessary to examine the different forms of oppression against different sections of the population, because it's extremely typical in bourgeois society for a bourgeois government to basically employ a very different form of repression against especially a racial or national minority. And this is, common, for example, in the Russian autocracy, where, before the revolution in Russia, there was laws against writing and speaking some other languages, and a policy of Russification of national minorities, and pogroms and other things that came with that. Now, actually, the Russian example is helpful for another reason. Namely, the communists who really wrote about the unique difference of fascism, Dimitrov, for example, was Russian. The communists in Russia, but many of them who were talking about and fighting against fascism in the 30s were part of the Russian Revolution. In Russia, under the Tsar, you had no freedom of speech, you had no freedom of assembly, you had no freedom to strike, you would be arrested, shot, or deported for many of these things. They didn't argue that Russia was fascist before the revolution. They said it was an absolutist monarchy with autocratic repression. Why is that? Because the mode of production was distinct. Namely, that Russia was a distinctly semi-feudal country in which finance capital had consolidated a bit of rule, but overall the state was semi-feudal. It was an absolutist monarchy in which the word of the Tsar was law. And the form of class rule reflected that political and economic reality. Because the bourgeois democratic revolution hadn't happened in Russia. And so the typical laws that existed in Russia, the laws that existed in Russia in that period were typical of the absolutist period of states in Europe. Like if you go back to absolutist France, in the Ancien regime, similar laws and restrictions and protests against protest and free speech and so on existed. And it was with the bourgeois revolutions and the struggles that followed them that a lot of these things were overturned and made legal and so on. And so if we look at the antebellum South, for example, we see that the repression reflected the mode of production there, which was a slave mode of production that was semi-capitalist, at least after the introduction of the cotton gin. Increasingly capitalist, actually, in that period, as Marx talks about. And so in that period, we don't have a form of fascist repression. We have a form of repression that's typical of a slave society, which doesn't mean it's less bad. It's not like a quantitative scale where fascism is the most repressive thing. But as Dimitrov notes in his quote, fascism is the power of finance capital. So finance capital, as Lenin talks about, is this fusion of banking and industrial capital that happens only after really the turn of the 20th century. And there's particular means and methods by which fascism oppresses people that are very distinct from how slave societies oppress people, very distinct from how feudal societies and absolutist monarchies oppress people, and so on. And hence the importance. It's not principally a quantitative distinction, but a qualitative one. And what's more, it's not really until the New Deal that the South is integrated, properly speaking, into the economy of Wall Street. And this is something that's talked about a lot by the communists in the 20s and 30s about, in the 30s, about how with the New Deal you have this like consolidation of the basically planter and sharecropper economy, which is semi-feudal almost economy in the South, to a more direct shift towards capitalist farming. And with that transformation comes a whole series of cultural and superstructural transformations. You don't want to be reductionist. It's not like economic just automatically leads to that. There's a whole complex interrelation between them. But you have in that period the persistence of various forms of Jim Crow segregation, obviously, but this is still not the same as a fascist repression for a series of important reasons. Now, I want to be square. The lynchings and the arrests of people, including arrests, for example, of Communist Party members for advocating the equality of white and black people. That was literally what Communist Party members were often arrested for in the South in the 30s, in the 20s. These things are very brutal. Those arrests were brutal, with the lynchings especially and everything else. But it was not a total and blanket and terroristic repression, even in the Jim Crow South, of all the organizing. And if you read about the work that the party did in the South, the communists did, it's helpful to get a sense. I mean, they faced very difficult conditions, very repressive conditions, but it wasn't the scale of repression of Nazi Germany. For example, they were able to hold some big public protests without just getting gunned down. Often the leaders would be arrested at those protests, and there'd be real repression, intense stuff. And they had to do some secret meetings in churches, other things, and the Klan terror was very real. But it's different than having like the mass concentration camps that were set up in Germany, or the mass arrests and massacres of communists and anarchists and trade unionists that took place in Japan when Japan became fascist, and so on. So there was, in that sense, also, I think, a quantitative difference to that period in the Jim Crow South and the fascist period in Germany and elsewhere. And that's not to belittle the brutality of that repression, but to go back to the fundamentals. Bourgeois democracy is very oppressive. Bourgeois democracy routinely commits massacres. Bourgeois democracy routinely, especially against oppressed minority groups, religious, national, racial, etc., caste, treats people with just incredible brutality. And if we deny that, as there was a tendency in the 60s and 70s, George Jackson is by no means unique in doing this, to label all repression as fascist, we let bourgeois democracy off the hook. And that's where that view eventually leads, actually, to supporting bourgeois democracy, and to a whole series of illusions about it. So hopefully that's helpful.
You talked a little bit about the breakdown of the traditional political divides that the bourgeoisie has used to conquer us. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what you think could be possible new divides that they try to institute specifically to win greater support, or at least some kind of acceptance or justification for the surveillance regime, and also specifically amongst the left movement, given the current crisis.
The question was, given what I said about the breakdown of traditional political divides in the U.S., what are some of the new ways that the bourgeoisie will attempt to rule the country, build new political divides, and pit people in one way or another against each other, especially on the left, like, and for the surveillance stuff. Yeah. Well, my guess is the immediate thing they'll go to is what they went to over and over again before, which is false flag attacks. Have a big terrorist attack happen, let it happen, make it happen, assassinate a politician, whatever. That's what they do. I mean, let's just be clear. The assassination of Charlie Kirk was clearly done to garner support for new counterterrorism stuff and for a new war on terror against the left and with trans-Tifa ideology. Now, we know basically definitively now that Charlie Kirk was killed at least by, and this goes back to the Mossad question, Mossad, and likely also by the US government. It's certain that the shooter, who they claim was the shooter, was not the shooter. None of the details add up. Just the Discord chat alone. Like, do you think Tyler Robinson, the Zoomer, wrote those messages to his supposed lover? Like, they read like a 75-year-old man wrote them. But all the other details about the shooting don't add up, and it's a lot of research has been done. It seems like Kirk was killed by his lapel mic that was rigged with an explosive, and hence why they rushed him off the scene while he was still alive and drove him to the furthest away hospital possible, and hence why they cleaned up all the lapel mic bits, and hence why they repaved the whole area where he was shot in less than 2 days. That's not something you do if you're not worried about the details of who was shot, how he was shot and everything. And hence why Kash Patel quashed an investigation into the details around the shooting. Yeah. Okay. Side note about Kirk. Now, he was a reactionary, very clearly, and basically a racist, but he was taking a stand against the Iran war, taking a stand against Israel's involvement in the U.S., politics broadly, and was also going to convert to Catholicism, which was seen as a real threat to the evangelical movement, because if you don't know, basically most of the evangelical churches in the U.S. are funded by Israel. And there's actually websites now you can go and look up how much Israeli influence is there in my church? How much is Israel funding my church? Because this is why, a big reason why so many young Christian Americans are converting to Catholicism and leaving the evangelical fold, because they're seeing it as just like a project of Israel. Okay, kind of not getting to your question, but I'll get there. I think some other stuff like this, false flag attack, my guess is they'll try to, especially now after like the election victory in New York, victory for the Dems, they have a communist thing that happens, where they have someone who's a communist nominally, who's like MK Ultra or has a Neuralink controlling them or whatever. And you should read about the MK Ultra program. People don't know. Most of the mass shooters and serial killers went through it. But where they have someone who's Neuralinked or MK Ultra or whatever shoot a politician, and that the person's a communist or whatever. So then the new crackdown on communist stuff. Trump just had a whole speech today about the dangers of communism, but also he said if he was a communist, he'd be the greatest communist ever. Kind of classic. That's how I think they'll try to rally actually a lot of the people on the right back to the Republican Party. That will be especially effective if there's also a willingness to basically dump Israel. Like, hey, Tucker's like, look, I'm against Israel and blah, 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 and the security stuff Israel is doing, but our government should protect us from dangerous radical ideologies like communism, which is fundamentally un-American, blah, blah, blah. I think we'll see that. And we need surveillance to do that, and we need good American companies. Already, actually, Tucker has had guests on there who are promising, what's his name, who runs Blackwater? I'm forgetting his name. People are saying it, but I can't hear it with the fan. It's okay. The head of Blackwater was on Tucker's show to promote a new security phone that'll keep you free from government spying and from Israel in particular. So these sort of things are now being promoted as a way to sell goods, but also an ideological formation that supports the U.S. state. We'll see more of that. On the left, I mean, the promise of treatlerism, just to be blunt about it, and I think that's the right term, like the promise you can go back to brunch, you can eat, nice, like you can go on living your commodity rich lifestyle, and there'll be a little bit of free childcare for you, or maybe. And I'm not decrying free childcare, but when they're spending billions and billions and billions of dollars to give a few thousand kids free childcare, what's going on? Like, where's all that money going? It's like the homeless programs in LA. Like, when they're spending $800,000 a year on homeless people to help homeless people, and the homeless people's lives are still very terrible, and they're still homeless, they still don't have anything, where's the $800,000 going? I mean, social democracy is a scam to increase public spending, to funnel it to big corporations and so on, especially in the US. But I imagine basically they'll have the social democratic politicians, in terms of rolling out surveillance, roll it out without talking about it so much directly as surveillance. They won't be like, oh, we need to keep us safe. I mean, they already have Zoran increasing NYPD numbers, their payroll, even when he promised he wouldn't. And he said he's going to get rid of this counterterrorism group that's used against the striking nurses and against Palestine protesters, but he's not. And what does Bernie Sanders want to do? He wants to nationalize the big AI companies. What does that mean? Give a bailout to OpenAI. They're not saying it that way. It's a different branding, but it's the same policies. So my guess is Zoran and others will do it that way. They'll frame it in terms of, oh, we're socializing the AI companies. Meanwhile, do you really think giving Sam Altman billions and billions of dollars, the guy who sexually assaulted his sister, who Aaron Schwartz said will do anything for power before the government killed Aaron Schwartz, do you really think giving Sam Altman, who met his husband at 3 a.m. in Peter Thiel's hot tub, billions and billions of dollars in integration to the US government under the name of socializing AI is going to lead to good things? No, it's going to lead to more surveillance. So this is the sort of branding that I think will be there on the left. And as the social democratic politics grow more popular, what we'll see is maybe a few social programs that are won not by the social democratic politicians, but by the mass struggles, but a shifting of rhetoric while increased government spending goes once again to benefit the big corporations and to expand the surveillance state. And for those who think that the government can't do social democratic programs and have social democratic branding while rolling out fascism, just look at Germany in 1919. It was the Social Democrats who came to power and carried out the counter-revolution. It was the Social Democrats who betrayed the working class movement and killed Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And I'm not saying that the individual people who vaguely support social democrats who are basically part of the masses, no, that's not them. The leaders of the movement, because it's a bourgeois ideology, and when push comes to shove, they defend bourgeois society tooth and nail, just like the capitalists. Because they are part of that class, actually, the social democratic politicians. And like AOC is a great example. Where did she get started? Funded by Israeli venture capital. And that's why she tweets way more about the Knicks' victory than she does about Gaza or the Iran war, anything else. Okay, a few more questions. Maybe we'll do one more round of questions and then wrap. 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Given the massive defeat that the U.S. and Israel has experienced as a result of the Iran war, and specifically the devastation and destabilization of Israel, do you see that having an impact on their ability to conduct surveillance in the United States? I know there's been strikes on different infrastructure, data centers in Israel. So do you see that as having a detrimental effect to them, or what do you think will happen?
The question is, given the defeats that the US and Israel have faced in the Iran war, and especially the strikes in the data centers, what impact will this have on their surveillance capabilities? It's a great question. Iran has made it very clear that data centers are military targets. And they are, they're military installations, basically. And Iran has hit a number of important data centers in the Middle East, in the Gulf states, in a number of different, not only data centers, but other infrastructure for spying and telecommunications in Israel. Basically, right after they did, a huge number of like pro-Zionist bots, but also a huge number of like different politicians' bots disappeared online. It's quite notable. People were commenting on how much better Twitter was after the data centers got hit. And it was very noticeable, actually, a lot fewer troll comments. And, you know, people mocked Elon Musk for saying this, but what he said was true, which is that maybe as much as 90% of the accounts on Twitter when he bought it were bots. That's the reality, is that a huge portion of what you see on the internet is bots. If we go back to that NSA memorandum about people not being free, but giving them the sense of subjective freedom through electronics. That's what we're talking about. And way back in 2008, and I'll get to this question a bit more in a second about surveillance specifically. Maybe it was 2000. Yeah, I think 2008, 2009. A group of MIT undergrads, always it's the MIT undergrads, they made the drone swarms. They didn't know what they were doing. It was for medical purposes they made drone swarms. They don't realize they're basically working with the Institute for Soldier Nanotechnology at MIT or whatever. But a series of MIT undergrad students worked on basically a novel form of network manipulation, where they were able to show how they were able to turn, it was in the 2008 election, a Facebook group that was for cat memes in 2 weeks into a Facebook group for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. They weren't the admins of this group. They just posted stuff in it, and they used a whole bunch of bots in 2008, 20 years ago. And the people who were in a cat group suddenly started posting more Hillary content. They followed the flow. So the destruction of these data centers weakens not only surveillance capabilities, the destruction of the data centers in the Iran war weakens not only surveillance capabilities, but also the network manipulation and control capabilities of the US and Israel. But most of their data centers for the US are not in the Middle East. So it's relatively minor. The bigger factor, though, is and I think like with surveillance stuff, we got to consider the social control that comes with it and so on. But that's why I'm mentioning this network manipulation stuff. But the bigger factor, really, with the decline of their ability to surveil is in their disorganization as a class, which is to say the US ruling class is very deeply divided right now over the war, over Israel, and continued support for it, over how to handle stuff with EU, over how to handle stuff with China. They're very divided. And that means that when they're divided, they're fighting for control of levers of power. There's not unity on how to handle things. And that weakens their ability to act as a class, and that weakens their ability to control the state in a unified fashion. One section may have more control of one section of the state versus another. Different intelligence agencies or sections within the intelligence agencies fight with each other. Military, like Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, Air Force intelligence, CIA, NSA, and then sections in them, they fight each other. These are complicated institutions, and the bourgeoisie backs one section or another. The members of these institutions, the high-ranking intelligence officials, are themselves big members of the ruling class. You might not ever see them as on a corporate board, but they're integrated into all the big corporations. And this is a point that Whitney Webb has made over and over again. It's not accurate to maintain a naive distinction between public and private when it comes to tech companies. But so too with oil companies and the defense contractors and so on. These are part of the government. Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, etc. Google, Apple, etc. Amazon, they're part of the government. They're integrated. You know, when Edward Snowden was working in NSA, what did he do? Who did he work for? What was his cover? He was a Dell employee. Actually, that might have been when he was for the CIA, I forget. But you get the picture. I can't hear you. Yeah, he worked for contractors. It worked as a contractor his entire time. He was an NSA employee, so they do most of it, but he was nominally employed by one or another big corporation in tech. That's how it works for a lot of NSA people. Hopefully that's helpful. There's a lot there. Okay, there was two others. Yeah, it's a great question. The question is, can I speak to some of the differences in fascist ideologies, especially the difference between the transhumanism stuff and like the Nazi ideology? So I'm not so well versed on all the dark Enlightenment thinkers, which is like the group around Peter Thiel. I know a little bit, and some other comrades in MCU have read more and shared some thoughts on it. So I'll speak briefly about some of this stuff. So Thiel is a transhuman. Actually, I'll do it this way. Anyone ever seen that Tim Dillon episode where he's like, they want to make AI, they think it's an ancient Sumerian demon. And he's like, I talk to people in tech, they think it's an ancient Sumerian demon they're summoning. And it's this high deity, this god from Gilgamesh or something they're bringing into being. And it's going to take your jobs and you're fucked. And they got to do this, or China's going to get their own ancient demon from AI and it's going to beat our demon. And that's why you're going to lose your job. Your Aunt Connie in Arizona should lose her job as a receptionist. He's pretty funny. I highly recommend it. He's being a bit tongue-in-cheek. But if you read people like Thiel or Yarvin or others, they talk about AI basically as a deity, as a kind of hyper-consciousness, as a perfect being. I mean, Jeff Bezos literally was saying, we're going to make this super intelligence. We got to give it all the water. That's why we can't have water. Now, ultimately, philosophically, what does this come down to? In a certain sense, a proposition very similar to Nazism, which is a magical and undivided body, a unity, without flaws or contradictions internally, which will solve all the problems. And you have to expel the problems to make this thing perfect. I mean, that's literally the discussion of the 1,000-year Reich and the body of the German people. And then Hitler said we each have to kill the Jew within us. And so the idea is there's this perfection that has to be, the problems can never be internal to it. It's got no division internally. Just kick out the foreign elements and we're good. Now, it's a bit different what Thiel and Yarvin are saying. They are racist. I mean, Yarvin, is it Hertzman? I think, he's the one who's for hyper-racism and says that white people should move into space and breed to create a pure white people, and while the rest of the people stay on Earth and deal with the problems here. But basically, it's a similar sort of framework where they believe basically through the creation of AI, something like the 1,000-year Reich can be achieved, where they're more selective. They're not talking about the authentic being of the German people or something like that, but rather that the ruling class can ascend to a form of deityship and integrate with machine intelligence and then be done with all these problems of being humans. And this sort of framework actually fundamentally, I think, is tied to the basically Kantian philosophical framework that they're putting forward and drawing on. Now, I want to be square. I'm not saying that Kant is a fascist. I don't particularly like Kant philosophically, but he's not a fascist. But the basic framework inherent in Kant's thinking is that humans are fundamentally finite, that our existence is one of finitude, and we can never really get to things as they really are, and because of our limited subjectivity, we just can't really do much beyond ourselves, and you never really can know things in themselves. And for Kant, he doesn't discount the possibility that better beings could have direct access to things in themselves and not be subjective like humans. In fact, Kant goes so far as to say that angels cannot experience beauty and do not, because they have direct access to things in themselves, if they exist. He says, if they exist, So this idea of our finitude and Heidegger takes it being towards death. He's a Nazi. No, it is a framework, a bourgeois political and philosophical framework, which I'm debating how much to get into philosophical problems. I'll mention very briefly. It's based on basically a Greek philosophical framework too, that argues the finite is just and one more, and you can never, or infinite is one more, and one more, you can never reach it. That's the domain of God. We know since the development of modern mathematics that this is a totally confused way of thinking of finite and infinite, that actually there's, with Georg and Cantor's breakthrough in axiomatic set theory, an infinity of different infinities, and this whole Kantian subject-object relationship is basically idealist nonsense. That's always been the Marxist position. Thiel and others, who basically hold on to this Kantian view, argue that all the limitations of humanity can be overcome if we can just get beyond basically our meat sacks. Like we're just a big sack of meat. And if we can get to this sort of transhumanism will have unlimited abundance, or the people who get to incorporate into the AI consciousness. Hence why, as we know from the leaks about Peter Thiel's Secret Society dialogue, why the so-called left liberal progressive side of this, people like Ezra Klein, who are promoting abundance theory with AI, are basically funded by Thiel too. The idea is that magically, once AI and this perfection is created, and whatever the cost we're going to pay, including people having no water, no big deal, everything will be solved. Just like once the 1,000-year Reich is realized, there'll be no problems in German society. So it's a very similar sort of framework in that regard. And what does Thiel say the Antichrist is? Any effort to limit the creation of AI. And you can basically pinpoint the exact point where Joe Rogan went from being kind of like a confused meathead bro who was critical of the government to being like totally bought and paid for, where after some of his meetings with Peter Thiel, he started to say, and if you think about it, like Jesus was born from a virgin birth, and like what's more of a virgin than AI? So couldn't it be the case that Jesus will come back as AI? So they're trying to sell it that way. There's a lot actually of specificity that's needed to analyze the nature of fascist ideologies. But always at the level of the imaginary, there's a regulatory fantasy of perfection without division. No internal divisions, just unity. Whereas for Marxists, everyone always divides into two. There's no thing that isn't made up of contradictions. Well, it's kind of somewhat imprecise, but basically all that is in motion, moving and developing, and has contradictions driving forward this motion and development. And the fascist ideology is based on precisely a fantasy of denying this and reaching some form of godhood. And not every ideology that believes in God or undivided unity is fascist, but for the fascist movement, this is like the central tenet of their belief. And then you expel the problems through extreme and brutal violence that would prevent that from being realized. My answer went further afield than I expected and covered a wide array of topics who may feel like, oh shit, I never read any Kant. I was meant to read something about him, and I know he's kind of influential, but don't worry, this is a lot to cover. Hopefully I at least answered some of your question. Unfortunately, given my relatively limited knowledge of the philosophy that Thiel and others put forward, I know a bit, but not so much, I had to answer somewhat in this way. Okay, last question. The question is, given what I mentioned about our collective amnesia of our popular struggles for collective liberation, what sort of key struggles in the US should we recall? I mean, the answer is, it's too long to list. I mean, it's the whole history of this country, from like countless slave revolts through the Panthers to the Molly Maguires and the Coal Wars, the battles of miners against the government, and the railway strike of 1877. You mentioned some of the strikes that took place, the Whiskey Rebellion and other rebellions, Shays Rebellion in Western Mass, that took place and basically forced the issue of the Bill of Rights. I mean, this country has been, since its very founding, a non-stop site of seething popular discontent. And at various times, the ruling class has been able to stabilize things a bit more, and then they lose that stability again. Why? Because it's a system that doesn't have the interests of the vast majority of the population at its heart. One particularly important strike is the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, that a bunch of women workers, textile workers, mostly immigrants, went on strike. And they were from immigrants from France and the Netherlands and elsewhere, and some from basically ruined farms in Vermont, not immigrants, but people born in the US. And in Lawrence, in the textile mills, they were dying 26, 27 years old from how bad things were. It was brutal. and they went on strike. And the slogan of the strike became bread and roses, which was the idea, well, we need bread, yes, because we're starving literally and dying, and our conditions need to be improved in the workplace, but bread is not enough for us to live. So roses stand in for beauty and some happiness and recreation in life, not just basically drudgery. And IWW led that strike, and it became a nationwide effort. But it was a very, very decisive but very, very, very important point. Actually, a big trend in that period of upsurge of the women's struggle in the working class movement. A huge number of women workers were coming forward in that period. But I'll also mention, and sadly often forgotten, the first general strike in the United States, which is the St. Louis Commune of 1877. This was part of the great railway strikes of 1877 that rocked the whole country. It was this major, major economic strike movement that grew into a political strike movement. The first political strike in this country, a strike where the working class really came forward as a class, as something distinct, not just as some workers in bourgeois society, but they were an entity, not just in their self-conception, but even their organization. And it was in its most militant sections of the strike were organized by the First International, which Marx and Engels were the head of, but they were in London at the time. And it was directly inspired, the St. Louis Commune, by the Paris Commune, which had happened 6 years before. And this railway strike, it spread all over the country. I'll get to the St. Louis Commune in a second, but it spread all over the country. Workers fought back. First, they would fight against like the Pinkertons and others. Then the police would be called in. They beat back the police in Baltimore and Philadelphia and elsewhere. Then the National Guard was called in, which wasn't under the federal troops at that point. There was only about 15,000 federal troops in the whole country. And then eventually the federal troops were called in to suppress the strike, and in the places they were successful. Over 100,000 workers went on strike. In St. Louis, the strike was led by the First International. They declared a general strike. They ran the city for 5 days. And in particular, and this is very important, there was strong unity between the black and the white workers. This is really, actually a lot of the black workers weren't in railways, a lot of them were in dock workers and other places, but they came together. And the ruling class freaked out. This is where the reaction to this, the ruling class eventually defeated it. It only lasted 5 days, but it's a very important strike struggle for a lot of reasons. But this is where the veiled prophet society started. Was the ruling class made that society as part of an effort to crush the militant remnants of the struggle there. And after 1877, the working class in the St. Louis Commune, the working class won some important concessions. The right to form unions, which were basically illegal before that point, and some better pay and concessions on work days and so on and so forth. And the U.S. was thereafter the first country to get the 8-hour workday in the world. But on the other hand, the ruling class, as Howard Zinn talks about in People's History of the United States, rolled out a whole new series of forms of repression and segregation. I mean, the unity of white and black workers threatened the U.S. ruling class so much that they really sought to ensure that didn't happen again. So they started to give a section of white workers these highly paid trade union jobs. And they excluded black workers from the unions, excluded women from the unions. And they built this whole system of stratification and solidified it after 1877 that aimed to keep the society divided and fighting each other for scraps. So it's important to understand both this incredible popular struggle, but also how the ruling class as reactionaries reacted to it and changed the society and changed bourgeois society, giving some concessions, but stratifying things in new ways to keep the people divided. And there's a slogan that kind of just gets repeated emptily at different US protests: the people united can never be defeated. But it is true that if we're able to unify the popular masses, the productive masses in this country, in revolt, they won't be defeated. The whole question then becomes how to unify them. And the slogans that follow often, like "show me what democracy looks like," "this is what democracy looks like," speaks to the ideological weaknesses of our present era and the inability to unify the masses. But the ruling class spends a tremendous amount of energy and effort and their intelligence, actually, where it exists, and it doesn't exist in all of them. But they spend a tremendous amount of energy and intelligence and effort to keep the people divided, to keep the class society stratified, to keep native-born workers fighting against immigrant workers, to keep white workers opposed to black workers taking their jobs or whatever, to keep men and women fighting against each other, etc. I'm not saying these forms of oppressions aren't real. There's real oppression and real stratification and real inequality in the society. But the ruling class ultimately promotes these, reinforces these, and promotes the subjective dispositions whereby the people fight each other. And these struggles, if we look at them, what we see time and time again is people, in order to even fight relatively modest struggles, had to overcome these divisions. And, for example, in the slave revolts, a lot of the divisions amongst the slaves themselves that were instituted by the slave owners had to be, fought against. Because, this, even within a plantation, there would be immense stratification. So that, the house slaves would feel like, they're better off than the ones in the field, etc. So these revolts, when we examine them and all these struggles, they teach us really what's needed. And they teach us really, most importantly, how people think. I don't mean recall data. ChatGPT does that. What I mean is how people put their minds together in the struggle to say, how the fuck do we get out of the mess we're in? How do we fight and how do we win? And that's really our history that we've forgotten. And if we could remember a bit of that and see that as a through line over and over again, like Mao said, struggle, defeat, struggle, defeat, struggle, defeat until the final victory, then we wouldn't feel so nihilistic, but we'd actually feel quite inspired and resolved. And we'd understand our own efforts, modest though they may be right now, as part of this long-term struggle for the liberation of the people. And then it'd be easier to understand how people can fight and sacrifice job and housing and even lives in this struggle. And we'd be able to overcome all the individualism that the ruling class has promoted. And when the people of this country do that, then we'll be unified into a force that will move mountains and topple governments. I'll end there. Thank you all so much for coming out. If you're not already signed up for the study, feel free to do so. I think most people here know about it, but yeah. And we'll have an anti-imperialist barbecue in Prospect Park at 3 p.m. on July 4th. So, if you want to do something nice on that holiday that celebrates the birth of the country, but it's like big flags and bombs and celebration, come out to the anti-imperialist barbecue. We'll probably play some volleyball. We'll have some food. We'll have some people maybe make speeches, read some poems. It'll be fun. Sing some songs. All right, everybody. Oh, very important. After a long interregnum of publishing articles, but not a journal, we have published the first issue of the second volume of our theoretical journal, Red Pages. This one specifically covers our internal rectification movement, where after a period of a lot of growth and development, we realized we had to solidify our ranks. And so we applied the lessons from the 1942 rectification campaign in China to our own context, which is very different. So check it out. It's very exciting to read.